The gas lamps flicker against the damp brick, their glow warping in the rising mist. The air smells of yeast and smoke, warm, then bitter, then wrong. Somewhere deep beneath Tottenham Court Road, iron groans. A single crack splits the silence, then another, sharper, like thunder inside a bottle. And then it happens, the sound of a city breaking. A brewery vat, vast as a cathedral, bursts open with the force of a cannon. A wall of beer, dark, foaming, alive, tears through the alleys of Street Giles. It surges through doorways, crushes fences, drowns the breath of the living. Children vanish mid-laughter. Mothers clutch their skirts in the flood. The sweet smell of porter fills every room, turning supper tables into graves. It is the height of industrial London, an empire built on progress, on profit, on pressure. The same hands that forged iron rails and empire wealth now tremble beneath their own invention. In a city drunk on advancement, it would not be war, nor plague, nor fire, that struck first, but beer. So tonight, keep the lamps burning low. Listen for the sound beneath the cobblestones. This is how it began the day beer killed a city, and London learned that even celebration can drown you. London wakes beneath a shroud of its own making. The dawn light never quite reaches the ground here, not in Street Giles, not between the narrow brick canyons where chimney smoke clings like memory. The air is thick and heavy, soaked with coal, horse dung, and the slow, sweet decay of yesterday's ale. Every breath carries the scent of survival. It smells of bread baking in cracked ovens, of steam from boiling clothes, of iron shoes on cobblestone, and always, always of beer. From the rooftops, the city hums. Bells toll somewhere to the east, their notes swallowed by fog. The markets are already waking, with hawkers shouting the price of onions, the clatter of wooden wheels, the rattle of tin cups. Along Tottenham Court Road, the Meux Brewery looms like a sleeping giant. Its great circular vats rise higher than the houses beside it, domed in black iron and banded with rings the size of cartwheels. Beneath them lies the pulse of London's thirst, hundreds of thousands of gallons of porter, brewed for men who labor from dawn until dusk, for women who scrub steps and sew buttons by candlelight. The smell from the brewery is almost alive. It rolls down the streets in invisible waves, thick and comforting molasses and roasted malt, warm yeast and smoke. The people of Street Giles call it their weather. On good days, it's a promise of wages and supper. On bad days, when the wind shifts, it's suffocating, a sweetness that turns sour by evening. Children grow up breathing it, their lungs marked by the same industry that feeds them. Inside the brewery walls, men work like ghosts. Steam hisses from copper pipes as they stir the mash tuns, the floor slick with spilled wort. Every surface glistens. Wooden planks creak beneath the weight of men and barrels. The laborers speak in short sentences. Mind your step. Hoist her slow. Pressure's high today. They joke sometimes, but even laughter sounds tired here. Each knows the danger of working beside boiling metal and fermenting liquid. Each knows that one mistake can scald, crush, or drown. But they also know the city runs on what they make. At the edge of the yard, black horses stand waiting, their breath misting in the cold. The carts they pull will carry barrels across London to taverns, brothels, hospitals, and soldiers' barracks. In every district, porter flows like a second river. The city drinks to forget its noise, its grime, its hunger. In the tap rooms of Street Giles, it's cheaper than water and twice as safe. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of production, there's another pulse. A vibration felt more than heard, like the deep heartbeat of something restless. The vats groan when the wind blows. Iron hoops tremble, unseen, against the weight of liquid and time. The foreman swears the noise is harmless, that the vats are strong, that the brewery has stood for generations. But even he can feel it, that faint, uneasy hum beneath his boots, the whisper of pressure building. Outside, London carries on. The bakers lift their shutters. Children chase one another through puddles. Smoke drifts lazily between the chimneys, and no one looks up. No one thinks about the river of beer sealed behind those iron walls. No one imagines that before the week is out, the smell that defines the city will turn from comfort to catastrophe. For now, the air is sweet. The vat stands still, and London breathes, unaware that it is inhaling the calm before its strangest storm. The Meux Brewery stands like a fortress at the edge of Tottenham Court Road, its walls stained the colour of smoke, its windows fogged by decades of vapour and toil. Beneath its roof, the air hangs warm and wet, forever trembling with the hiss of boiling wort and the hum of steam pipes. The great vats rise in the half-light like temples to a new god, industry. Their rounded bellies are slick with condensation, breathing quietly in the heat, each holding thousands of gallons of dark porter. The brewery was built for excess. London demanded it. Every pub, every tavern, every narrow gin shop had turned to beer as salvation, cheaper than milk, cleaner than water, and strong enough to dull the edge of endless labor. The men who owned the brewery knew this well. Their profits ran faster than the Thames. Their cellars stretched under the city like a buried cathedral, lined with barrels that never slept. The workers called it the underground sea. Each vat was bound by great iron hoops, black and glistening, tightened with the precision of a shipwright. The largest among them, a leviathan of wood and metal, held more than 1.5 million litres of beer. It was known simply as the Monster. Every man who worked there knew its presence, the low creak of its staves when the night grew cool, the shudder in the floor when the fermenting porter swelled. Some men swore it was alive, that it breathed when no one was near, exhaling the scent of yeast and danger. On this particular October morning, the Monster was restless. The cooper, an old man named George Crick, ran a hand along its flank, feeling for weakness. The wood was warm, pulsing faintly under his palm. He listened, ear pressed close, the way a sailor might listen to the sea inside a shell. Somewhere within the vat, a faint tapping answered back, tiny, rhythmic, like a clock buried deep inside. He frowned, but said nothing. A brewer learns early that to question the vats is to question the livelihood of everyone within earshot. Above him, the rafters dripped condensation. Dust floated in golden shafts of steam-filtered light. Outside the walls, carts rattled, dogs barked, and the hum of London life continued without pause. Yet inside, everything felt still, suspended in the amber air. The men worked with the slow rhythm of habit, scraping residue, hammering hoops, checking gauges. The master brewer, a thick man with soot-blackened hands, took notes in his logbook, recording the temperature, the yeast bloom, the time. Numbers written without emotion, an alchemy of profit. At noon, the bell rang for the midday meal. Workers sat on barrels, chewing bread and meat, laughing about nothing. Someone joked that if one of the vats ever burst, the whole district would drink itself to death. Laughter echoed through the rafters, but George didn't join in. He kept glancing toward the Monster, where a single drop of beer had begun to weep through a seam, running down the side like sweat. He wiped it away, but another followed, darker, thicker, slow as syrup. Outside, the street vendors were calling for customers. The city roared, indifferent, and deep within the brewery, iron strained against iron, the pressure built unseen, a quiet tide rising beneath the sound of human chatter. By evening, the bellows of the furnace sighed lower, the workers gone, and the brewery sank into its nightly hum, a creature at rest. But in the stillness of its heart, the Monster shifted once more. The iron hoop shivered, then stilled. A single echo passed through the cellar like a whisper through a crypt. London slept above it, unaware that beneath its streets, a river of ale was already beginning to wake. By dawn, the brewery breathed again. The furnaces came alive with a low rumble, filling the air with a sound like distant thunder muffled by stone. Steam rose from copper stills and drifted toward the rafters, wrapping the beams in a gauzy fog that smelled of yeast, oak, and iron. The men arrived one by one, caps low over their eyes, boots slick with last night's rain. Their faces were pale from the heat, lined with soot and labor. For them, the Meux Brewery was not just work, it was survival, and for some, a kind of worship. The men spoke little as they moved through the maze of pipes and pulleys. They had all learned to listen instead, to the hiss of the boilers, to the slow creak of timber, to the soft ticking of metal under strain. Every sound mattered. A new noise might mean a split seam, a swelling joint, a hairline crack invisible to the eye but deadly to the touch. The vats, especially the great one, were temperamental. They demanded attention like wild animals appeased by care, but never truly tamed. Among them was a cooper named John Perry, younger than most but already carrying the scars of his trade-thin silver lines that marked where staves had splintered or hoops had slipped. His hands were calloused, his hearing half gone from the roar of boiling copper, yet he worked with the patience of a craftsman. He had been trained by old Crick himself, who stood across the floor now, examining the monster vat with narrowed eyes. "Mind the bindings," Crick muttered. "They've got a mind of their own lately." Perry nodded, though he didn't need reminding. The monster stood like a mountain of wood and steel in the half-light, its black hoops glinting with moisture. The smell around it was different, stronger, almost metallic beneath the sweetness. He tapped one of the rings with the handle of his mallet and listened. The sound was dull, not the bright, clean note of tight iron, but something heavier, tired. Across the room, the brewmaster called out for the morning's temperature reading. Two men hoisted a ladder, climbing to the rim of the giant vat to dip the long thermometer into the frothing dark below. A wave of heat and scent rose up: malt, sugar, fermentation, life itself in slow transformation. They coughed and laughed, wiping sweat from their faces. "She's angry today," one of them joked. "Too full by half." Crick didn't laugh. He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped closer, peering along the seams where the iron met the wood. Tiny beads of porter had gathered again, sweating from within. He pressed a rag to the spot, and when he pulled it away, it was wet and sticky. The others didn't notice. They were already rolling barrels, hammering lids, shouting for rope. The noise of the brewery was deafening, now a symphony of clanks, bangs, and steam. By mid-morning, the floor trembled with motion. Horses neighed outside, carts loaded, boots struck the stone in rhythm. It was a living machine, the city's heart pumping through the brewery's veins. But in the spaces between the noise between hammer and hiss, something else moved. A deep, hollow groan, slow and aching, like the voice of a giant buried alive. Crick froze, head tilted, eyes wide. The sound came again, faint but certain. He turned to Perry. "You hear that?" Perry frowned, still holding his mallet. Just the barrels settling. But Crick didn't answer. He kept listening, eyes fixed on the vat as though it might breathe. And somewhere beneath the iron hoops, it did. Outside, London went on living, markets bustling, carriages clattering, taverns opening their shutters. No one could hear the whisper that echoed under Tottenham Court Road, where 1,000 tons of beer pressed against its prison walls, and the men of the vat worked on, unaware that their day had already begun to end. The smell of porter was the smell of London itself, sweet and heavy, clinging to every street like fog. You could trace it from the breweries of Street Giles to the ale houses of Holborn, from the taverns along the Thames to the markets at Covent Garden. It rolled through the city's veins, poured from barrels into pewter mugs, spilled over counters, and soaked into the cobblestones until even the rain couldn't wash it away. For the working class, porter was more than drink. It was bread, warmth, medicine, and escape. It was called the people's beer, thick, dark, and filling, brewed from the charred malt that gave it its black sheen and bittersweet soul. The dock workers and masons drank it by the pint, the washerwomen by the half. Children sipped it, watered down, mixed with milk when water was too foul to trust. Even the sick took it, recommended by doctors as a tonic for fever, melancholy, or childbirth. It was the heartbeat of the capital, a drink that kept men on their feet and dulled the ache of living. Every pint had its journey. It began in the Meux Brewery, Deep in the iron-bellied vats where barley met fire and time, workers stirred the mash with wooden paddles taller than themselves, muscles burning in the heat. They shoveled heaps of malt, measured yeast by instinct, and listened for the gentle hiss that meant life had begun in the brew. The air shimmered with the scent of sugar and smoke, and the floors ran slick with spillage. Every drop that escaped was a drop lost to profit, but none of the men dared complain. The black porter was proud stuff. It carried the city's labor in its color. Its darkness was honest. It didn't pretend to be refined like champagne or gin. It was the drink of the poor, and yet it had made rich men of brewers. The Meux family knew this. Their vats were larger than those of any rival. Their output measured not in gallons but in oceans. Their name carried across London like a brand of royalty. In taverns, landlords boasted of carrying Meux's best. But power brings blindness. The brewery's pride was not in taste or craft, but in size, the monstrous scale of its operations, the gleaming iron hoops that wrapped each vat like chains around a captured beast. Visitors came to stare at them, marveling at the sheer volume of beer stored beneath the city streets. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see over the brick walls, their fathers pointing and saying, "That's progress." Yet progress always hums with danger. No one thought about the weight pressing down on those wooden staves. No one measured what millions of pints might do when trapped behind aging bolts and rusting rivets. For all its perfection, the black porter carried a secret, an unspoken pressure building beneath its calm surface. As night fell, taverns came alive. Men spilled from factories, their wages already destined for the brewers' coffers. Candles flickered in windows, lighting rooms filled with laughter and song. The mugs clanged, the tables shook, and the city swayed under the intoxication of its own creation. Somewhere, someone toasted to the good life, to Meux's finest, to London's pride. And back in the brewery, the vats breathed in silence. Inside the largest one, the monster the porter moved restlessly. It seethed and frothed like a storm beneath wood and iron, yearning for release. The hoops creaked softly, like ropes under strain, but no one heard them over the noise of the city. The porter that had built London's joy would soon drown it. The beer that filled the poor man's belly would flood his home. Yet for now, the streets rang with laughter, and the sweet scent of malt drifted through the fog, an omen mistaken for comfort, a promise that would soon turn to ruin. It began as a tremor so slight that no one noticed. Not the foreman shouting orders from the catwalk, not the men hauling barrels to the loading bay, not even the rats that nested in the warm corners of the brewery's cellar, their whiskers twitching at the scent of malt and moisture. The sound came low and distant, like a groan from the earth itself, a deep vibration, steady and patient, threading through the floorboards of Meux's Horseshoe Brewery. George Crick was the first to feel it. He was kneeling at the base of the great vat, tightening a hoop with his iron mallet when the wooden planks shivered beneath his boots. It wasn't much, just a quiver, a ripple through the soles of his feet. He paused, listening. The air seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the gentle hiss of fermenting beer and the rhythmic click of the pressure gauge above his head. He ran a hand along the vat's curved side. It was warm, too warm and wet, with a slow weeping of porter through the grain of the staves. He called to one of the boys, a thin apprentice no older than 15. "Bring me a fresh rag," Crick said, not taking his eyes off the vat. The boy hurried off, boots clattering, and came back with cloth in hand. Crick wiped the leak again. The stain darkened instantly, spreading like blood through linen. He pressed harder. The wood pulsed beneath his palm. Something was alive in there, something immense and angry. Overhead, the brewery echoed with the clang of metal and the creak of pulleys. Steam hissed from copper pipes like breath through clenched teeth. The men were used to noise. It was the language of their trade. But beneath the usual chorus, a new sound had joined, a low, rhythmic thudding. It was the heartbeat of pressure, slow at first, then stronger. The iron hoops that circled the vat began to hum faintly, their edges vibrating against the bolts that held them. Perry, the young cooper, stopped stacking barrels and turned his head. "You hear that?" he shouted to no one in particular. His words were swallowed by the roar of the furnaces. He shrugged and went back to work. Crick climbed the ladder to the catwalk, inspecting the vat from above. The air was hot, thick with the scent of sugar and steam. He leaned over the rim and saw the dark surface of the porter below, still, but not quiet. Tiny ripples spread across it, disturbed by the restless fermentation. The liquid hissed softly, a living thing confined. Crick wiped the sweat from his brow, uneasy. He had tended these vats for decades, and they had always spoken to him in creaks and sighs. But this was different. He descended again and placed his ear against the wood. What he heard made his skin crawl. A hollow knocking, faint but deliberate, from somewhere deep within the vat. Tap, tap, pause, tap, as if something was trying to escape. By now the floorboards trembled with each pulse. Dust drifted down from the rafters. The apprentice stared wide-eyed as a tremble. Single bolt near the vat's base rattled loose, its thread slick with moisture. Crick tightened it quickly, his hands shaking. "It's nothing," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. "Just the wood settling. Always does that when it's warm." But even as he said it, another sound rolled through the brewery, deeper, louder, like thunder trapped underground. The men froze, tools in hand. Somewhere, glass shattered. A thin stream of beer shot out from a seam in the vat, arcing across the floor like a fountain before fading. Then silence. The men looked at one another. Crick's face was pale beneath the grime. He wiped his hands and forced a chuckle. "She's testing us," he said softly. "That's all." But the silence that followed was too perfect, too heavy. Beneath the floor, the sound returned, a long, slow groan that no one could mistake this time. The monster was waking, and the brewery, with all its iron and pride, was beginning to tremble in fear. On the upper floor of the brewery, away from the steam and shouting, a single gas lamp burned above a scarred wooden desk. The light caught the edge of a brass compass, a half-empty cup of tea, and the cracked leather cover of a book, the engineer's ledger. Every line inside was neat, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who trusted numbers more than men. In those numbers, the entire life of the Meux Brewery was measured and contained, the gallons brewed, the temperatures reached, the weights pressed by liquid and steam. Edward Woodhouse, chief engineer, had been with the brewery for 12 years. He'd arrived when the vats were still new, when the smell of oak and tar pitch was fresh and sharp. In those early years he had been proud of the precision, the power, the way the brewery seemed to defy nature itself. But lately, pride had turned to fatigue. The city's thirst grew faster than their capacity to contain it, and the company's owners, gentlemen in fine coats, who never set foot in the brewhouse, demanded ever more. Bigger vats, higher yields, less time to rest the staves. Woodhouse sighed as he dipped his pen. The ledger's latest entry stared back at him. Main vat holding 3,550 barrels. Iron band replaced 24 October. Slight strain noted on upper joint. No further issue reported. He paused, tapping the nib against the edge of the page. Slight strain. The words were a lie of omission, one that kept the ledger tidy and the bosses calm. The truth was more troubling. The vat was old, its wood tired, its seams weeping under the constant pressure. He'd ordered repairs twice that year, but replacing a single hoop meant halting production for days, and days meant losses. The Meux family wanted profit, not caution. He turned the page, where calculations filled the margins. Volumes, pressures, temperatures, all balanced like a house of cards. A faint vibration shook the desk. The lamp's flame flickered. He looked up. For a moment, the air itself seemed to quiver. Somewhere below, a dull clang echoed iron on stone. Then, silence. Woodhouse set down his pen. He walked to the window, which looked down upon the vast interior of the brewery. The vats loomed in rows, shadows among shadows, their surfaces glinting with moisture. Steam curled upward like smoke from sleeping giants. Everything looked as it always had, calm, orderly, inevitable. And yet, the engineer felt the same unease that had haunted him all week. He could feel the weight of those millions of gallons pressing against his thoughts. He reached for his ruler and began a new note. Recommend pressure release tomorrow a.m. Inspect western hoop for slippage. But as he wrote, the nib skidded. The desk shuddered again. A faint tremor traveled up through the floor, followed by a deep, hollow groan that seemed to come from the building's bones. Not now, he whispered, almost pleading. He closed the ledger and pressed his palms against the wood, feeling it vibrate like the skin of a drum. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. It was young Perry, breathless, cap in hand. "Sir, the cooper says the big vat's leaking again." Woodhouse's stomach turned. He snatched his coat and followed the boy down the narrow iron steps, the smell of molten steam growing stronger with every descent. The sound deepened as they neared the cellar, a steady, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat amplified through timber. When they reached the great vat, the men had gathered round. Crick stood closest, his face white, one hand pressed to the wood. Beer was seeping through the seams now, forming thin rivers along the floor. The iron bands glistened wetly in the lamplight. Woodhouse opened his ledger, his fingers trembling. "Note this," he murmured to himself, writing the last words he would ever record. 24 October, 1814. Pressure, irregular. Hoop, compromised. Immediate repair required. The pen scratched to a stop. The groan beneath their feet grew louder. In the quiet that followed, the ink was still wet when the first bolt tore loose. On New Street, just beyond the shadow of the brewery walls, lived a woman named Mary Mulvey. Her world was a single room on the ground floor of a leaning tenement, its plaster cracked, its window patched with paper, and its floorboards warped by damp. The room smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage, a smell so constant it clung to her clothes like a second skin. She shared the space with her two children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 4, both asleep now on a mattress stuffed with straw. Mary sat by the fire, mending shirts by the orange light. Her husband, a laborer at the brewery, had been gone since before sunrise, leaving only his mug on the table and the faint smell of malt on his coat. Outside, the evening fog had thickened, curling against the window pane like breath. The city beyond was a muffled chorus, carriages on cobblestone, a shout, a dog's bark, the faint bell of a passing church hour. The brewery's constant hum filled the silence between those sounds. It had become the heartbeat of her street, something too steady to notice anymore. She hummed softly as she worked, one hand steadying the needle. Her daughter stirred, coughing in her sleep, and Mary paused, listening. The air was warm and close. The fire spat once, sending a spark up the chimney. Somewhere in the walls, water dripped a slow, patient rhythm that matched her breathing. Then, beneath that, another sound, a deep, hollow murmur. She frowned. The floor trembled slightly, just enough to make the water in a bowl quiver. The rumble came again, stronger now, rolling beneath the ground like distant thunder. She rose, setting her sewing aside. The air seemed thicker somehow, the warmth pressing against her chest. She crossed to the window and peered out, but the alley beyond was hidden in fog. Only the glow of the brewery lamps showed through, yellow and shifting. Then came a sound, like no thunder she had ever heard, a great metallic crack, sharp and final, followed by a roar so vast it seemed to swallow the world. The ground shook violently, throwing her backward. The bowl of water tipped and shattered. The door flew open as if struck from the outside. A rush of wind slammed through the room, carrying with it a smell so strong it stung her eyes. Beer. The next sound was worse, a flood's roar, closer, rising. She grabbed her children, half asleep and terrified, clutching them to her chest. Outside, men shouted, their voices drowned by the oncoming deluge. The floorboards buckled underfoot, and she could hear the surge coming through the alley, fast as a storm tide. She ran for the back wall, for the window, for anywhere, not in the path of that noise, but there was no time. The first wave struck the building with the force of a battering ram. The door splintered inward, and the room filled in an instant, a wall of dark porter crashing through with unimaginable power. The fire hissed and vanished. Furniture spun like driftwood. Mary held her children tight, choking as the sweet, sick scent filled her lungs. She reached for the window ledge, found it for one heartbeat, and then the current tore her free. Outside, the street had become a river frothing brown alive. The brewery's vat had burst, and the flood was sweeping through the slums of Street Giles, through kitchens and cellars, through homes like hers. In the chaos, the sound of breaking wood and screams blended with laughter from those too drunk or stunned to understand what was happening. When the torrent finally passed, the room was unrecognizable. The fire was gone, the window gone, even the walls slick with beer and mud. Mary's sewing lay tangled around a chair leg, a needle still glinting faintly in the lamplight. The silence that followed was complete, thick, sweet, and impossible. In the street beyond, the smell of malt was everywhere. The city that had lived on porter was now drowning in it. For weeks, the monster had whispered its warning in the dark. A sigh here, a shudder there, but men are slow to hear what they cannot afford to fix. Inside the Horseshoe Brewery that October afternoon, the air was thick as broth, heavy with the perfume of fermenting porter. The floors gleamed with damp. The walls sweated from the heat of the vats. Outside, the gas lamps had already been lit against a low sky the color of pewter, and a faint drizzle streaked the windows. In the great fermentation room, George Crick stood once more before the largest vat, his mallet tucked under his arm. The sound beneath the floor had been louder that day, and the wood seemed to breathe in uneven rhythms, swelling and settling, groaning faintly under its own colossal burden. Steam drifted around him like ghosts, catching the light in wavering gold. "Pressure's up again," said Perry, entering with a ledger under his arm. "Gauge shows higher than yesterday." Crick didn't answer right away. He was watching a single bead of beer crawl down the curved side of the vat, slow, deliberate, unending. It left a shining trail in its wake. He touched it with his finger, sniffed, and frowned. "Too warm," he muttered. "She's overboiling herself." Perry shrugged. "Then we bleed it off. Same as before." "Same as before won't do," Crick replied. "She's been bleeding for days now, and still the pressure climbs." From above came the rhythmic pounding of men tightening hoops on smaller vats, the steady clang of hammer on iron. The brewery was a machine that never stopped. Every hour was worth gold, every delay a loss. No one spoke of danger, only output, weight, yield. Even now, while the floor trembled faintly underfoot, there was laughter from the far end of the hall where barrels were being loaded for transport. Crick bent to check the iron rings again. The fifth hoop, the one nearest the base, looked wrong, just slightly off-center. A fine mist of beer had formed around its edge, glistening in the lamplight like sweat on a fevered brow. He ran his hand along it, feeling the faint vibration deep in the wood. The monster was restless. Perry stood back, wiping his brow. "Maybe she just needs tightening." Crick shook his head. "You can't tighten what's already straining to burst." And then it came, the sound that would be remembered by every man in that room until his dying day. A single, clean crack. Not loud at first, more like the snapping of a whip, sharp enough to slice through the din. All motion stopped. The air froze. Even the steam seemed to hang still in the lamplight. Perry turned toward the vat. What was? Before he could finish, a second crack followed, louder, longer, echoing off the brick walls. The great iron hoop around the vat shuddered visibly, dust falling from the rafters above. Then a third, like thunder inside a barrel. "Out!" Crick shouted. "Get out!" The workers hesitated, stunned by the sudden violence of sound. One man dropped his wrench and stumbled toward the stairs. Another crossed himself. The vat groaned, a terrible low note that rose into a metallic scream. The first rivet tore free. whistling past Crick's ear like a bullet. A gush of beer sprayed out, hot and pungent, splattering across the floor. The pressure gauge above the vat spun wildly before shattering, scattering shards of glass like rain. Crick ran for the door, shouting again, but his voice was lost to the roar now rising from the vat's core. The sound was unlike anything human, an unholy mixture of thunder, wind, and the grinding of stone. And then, all at once, the world broke open. With a final deafening boom, the vat split apart, its iron bands snapping in a chorus of screams. The wall beside it cracked like an eggshell, and a river of black porter exploded outward, swallowing the light, the air, and every sound but its own. Above the brewery, the gas lamps flickered. On the street, outside, a single woman paused, confused by what she thought was thunder. But the storm had already begun, not in the sky, but beneath her feet. The world ended not with fire, but with beer. At 5:30 inches the evening, the heart of the Meux Brewery split apart in one cataclysmic roar that shattered glass half a mile away. The great vat, 30 feet tall and weighing more than 100 tons when full, gave way in a single convulsion. The first sound was a metallic shriek, a sound so sharp it seemed to pierce the skull, followed by a blast that tore through the walls with the fury of a cannon. For a single heartbeat, everything froze: the men on the catwalk, the clerk in the counting room, the horse outside, tethered to a delivery cart. Then came the flood. A wall of black porter, nearly 15 feet high, burst from the cellars in a surge of steam and splintered wood. The explosion hurled iron hoops like shrapnel through the rafters. One slammed into a beam with a clang that echoed like a church bell. Another struck the far wall and embedded itself in brick. George Crick was thrown backward, his body flung like a rag doll against the far door. The air turned to liquid, the ground to chaos. For one sickening instant, he could not tell up from down, only the force of 1,000 barrels roaring past him, sweeping tools, tables, and men alike into its path. The smell was overwhelming: hot malt, yeast, smoke, and the metallic tang of torn iron. The floor gave way. The wave punched through the brewery walls as if they were paper. Outside, the street had only a moment to breathe. Then the porter burst into the open, carrying bricks, timber, and bodies into the light. The flood hit the tenements of Street Giles with unstoppable speed. Houses crumbled, their foundations softened by the force of the torrent. Windows shattered, doors were ripped from their hinges. Inside the Mulvey home, what had begun as a tremor was now a storm. The beer poured through alleys, sweeping everything before it: furniture, firewood, even whole walls. The wave lifted carts from the street, slammed them into corners, and kept moving. People were caught mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-breath. The water rose so fast it had no shape, only a sound, deep and endless. Back in the brewery, the rest of the vats, 9 of them, each enormous, were struck by the shock wave. One after another, their seams gave way. The combined force unleashed over 320,000 gallons more, amplifying the deluge until it roared like an underground sea. The building's roof lifted and fell in slow motion before collapsing entirely, sending timbers crashing into the flood below. Crick clawed his way to his knees. Around him, the brewery was unrecognizable, a boiling pit of foam and debris. He called out names, but the roar drowned him. The porter was knee-deep already, carrying barrels that rolled like cannonballs. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed before being swept away. Outside, a horse reared in panic before vanishing beneath the dark wave. A lamppost tilted, then sank. The porter found the slope of the street and followed it downhill, gaining speed, pouring into every doorway, cellar, and crack. In the span of a minute, the flood covered an area the size of a city block. People watching from upper windows could only stare. Some swore it looked alive, a living thing born of man's ambition, devouring its maker. Others claimed they heard voices in it, as if the beer itself were singing, roaring its freedom after years of imprisonment. When the pressure finally eased, the flood spread outward in silence. A vast, glistening pool stretching across the district. Bits of wood, straw, and clothing floated lazily on its surface. The sweet smell of porter hung in the air like incense after mass. Above the wreckage, the brewery groaned once more and fell still. What remained of the great vat lay open like the ribs of a whale. From its shattered mouth, the last of the beer dripped steadily, drop by drop, into the ruin below, a slow, mocking heartbeat, marking the moment London drowned in its own thirst. The flood moved faster than thought. One moment, Tottenham Court Road was alive with evening light, the hiss of lamps, the chatter of carts and vendors, the distant bells marking supper hour, and the next, it was gone. A wall of beer, black and shining, rose from the brewery's broken belly and crashed through the narrow alleys of Street Giles like a beast loosed from a cage. It had no right to move as it did. It was too heavy, too thick, too much a thing of earth and barrel and man-made iron, and yet it flowed like a river in full spate, driven by the weight of its own birth. The first to see it were the children. They had been playing in the gutter, tossing stones and sticks, when the brewery wall exploded into daylight. For an instant, they only gaped at the glistening tide sweeping toward them, the color of night and gold together. Then it hit. The noise was beyond description, a mixture of thunder, wind, and the tearing of wood. The street was ripped apart in seconds. The wave turned corners, smashed through brick as though it were paper, and climbed over itself in rolling crests of foam. It was no longer beer as people knew it. It was a living force, carrying barrels, beams, and bodies in its wake. Tables, chairs, and window shutters whirled through the torrent. Horses, shrieking, vanished beneath the froth, their reins trailing like kelp. The narrow lanes funneled the flood toward the poorest homes, where the foundations were already weak from damp. The tenements groaned and tilted as the porter rammed their walls. Windows shattered, doors flew outward. Inside one such home, an elderly man was seated at supper, his plate of bread and onions still in his hand when the water burst through. It hurled him backward, carried him up the stairs, and left him caught among splintered beams. Outside, people screamed for loved ones, but the sound was swallowed. Mothers clutched their children to their chests, trying to wade through the swirling brew, their skirts dragging like anchors. The porter rose waist-deep, chest-deep, sweeping them toward the next street and the next. The waves struck the wall of the Tavistock Arms Tavern with the force of an avalanche. The building shuddered. Its lower floor collapsed, burying the patrons beneath shattered beams and beer barrels. For an instant, those outside could see the tavern's sign swing once, twice, then vanish completely under the black surge. Further downhill, where the street opened into the low courts of Street Giles, the flood spread out, slowing but deepening. It filled the cellars first, trapping those who had fled below. The noise that followed was ghastly, a chorus of pounding fists against locked doors. Then nothing. Up in the higher streets, bystanders gathered, staring in awe at the rolling brown sea. Some laughed, thinking it a miracle, a river of free beer delivered to their doorsteps. Men dipped mugs into the torrent, drinking greedily, until they realized what floated past, and them fragments of doors, cloth, and something pale that might have been a hand. The laughter died. When the pressure eased, the wave began to settle. Foam clung to walls 6 feet high. Windows dripped. The cobblestones were hidden beneath a glistening sheet of porter that still moved, sluggish but alive, carrying with it the smell of malt and iron and death. The people of London would later call it a flood, but that word was too clean, too biblical. Floods came from nature, from rain and river. This had come from man, from ambition and negligence, from vats too large and pride too great. It was not water that had destroyed Street Giles that evening. It was progress, turned liquid and vengeful, and as the sun sank behind the blackened rooftops, the wave that should never have existed continued its crawl through the dying light, glinting like spilled treasure in the gutters of a broken city. When the roaring stopped, the silence was unbearable. It settled thick and suffocating over the wreckage, over the bodies, over the sea of brown liquid that now glimmered faintly in the dimming light. The flood had spent itself, and what remained was a stillness so profound that every creak of timber, every drip of beer from shattered beams, seemed to echo like a whisper in a cathedral. The air was heavy with the smell, sickly sweet, warm, and relentless. Malt, yeast, iron, and something else beneath it all, something human. The scent rolled through the ruins like fog, clinging to hair, to fabric, to the skin of the living and the dead alike. It was the same smell that had once meant comfort, laughter, and livelihood. Now it was the smell of ruin. Down by New Street, the flood had begun to settle, its surface black and glossy, broken only by floating wreckage. The porter filled the basements and cellars, creeping into corners, soaking through floors. In one such cellar, 2 men waded waist-deep through the wreckage, lanterns raised. They were searchers, locals, who had come not out of duty, but curiosity. They thought perhaps there might be barrels unbroken, beer still drinkable, a miracle amid disaster. But when their light caught the far wall, they froze. There, half submerged, was the pale arm of a woman, her fingers still curled as if clutching something. The fabric of her dress billowed gently in the liquid, ghost-like, swaying with each ripple. One man muttered a prayer, the other turned away and vomited. The lantern light trembled. Above them, on the street, survivors gathered in small clusters. Some stood in shock, clothes soaked, faces blank. Others wept openly, kneeling in the beer that pooled around their feet. A few laughed a thin, hysterical sound that broke quickly into sobs. Children clung to mothers who no longer spoke. The smell of malt made their eyes sting, their stomachs churn. The brewery itself was a ruin. The great vat lay in pieces, its splintered staves jutting from the wreck like ribs from a carcass. The iron hoops were twisted into shapes no blacksmith could have imagined, their edges sharp and gleaming. The floor was gone, swallowed by the torrent that had torn through the walls. Somewhere beneath the wreckage, George Crick's body floated, his mallet still in hand. As night fell, the gas lamps reflected on the surface of the flood, casting pale halos that wavered with every ripple. Rescue teams arrived hours too late. They brought stretchers, ropes, blankets, but not enough of any. They pulled out what they could: a man with broken legs, a child whose face was still, a dog that whimpered once and went quiet. The smell followed them wherever they went. By midnight, the flood was no longer moving. The beer had gone stagnant, thick and warm, coating everything it touched with a film of sweetness. Rats came first, drawn by the scent, then stray dogs. By morning, the flies would arrive. A reporter from the Forensics Times waded through the wreckage, notebook in hand, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. He took notes on damages, on deaths, on property lost, but what he would remember most was the smell, that clinging perfume of molten blood that refused to leave even after he returned home. It filled his dreams for weeks. Across London, people woke to the news that beer had killed a city. Some refused to believe it, others joked darkly about drowning in good cheer. But in street, Giles, there was no laughter, only that heavy sweetness lingering in the dawn air, a scent that made every breath feel like guilt. By morning, the porter had begun to seep into the drains, slipping silently into the Thames, but the smell stayed behind, woven into the very bricks. And for years after, when the rain fell on that corner of London, the scent would rise again, faint, bitter, and mournful, as if the city itself remembered. When the flood came, the first to die were those who lived lowest. The basements of Street Giles were a world beneath the world, dark warrens of families, beggars, and labourers who could not afford the daylight. There were no windows, only vents choked with soot. The ceilings dripped from the rain, the walls breathed mildew. In these underground rooms, life was already half drowned long before the beer arrived. The porter reached them last, yet it struck hardest. It rushed down the narrow stairways in a single wave, a black tide that filled the cellars faster than breath could be drawn. In one such room, The Sullivan family huddled together. The father was away at the brewery, leaving Mary Sullivan with her 3 children, Thomas, Ellen, and baby Rose. The older 2 were playing near the hearth, stacking bits of broken slate into towers, when the first sound came. A dull rumble, then a roar like wind through a tunnel. Mary turned toward the stairs just as the door burst open. A wall of beer crashed down, sweeping her from her feet. She managed to grab the edge of the table, pulling Ellen close, but Thomas was already gone, swallowed in an instant. The water was warm and thick, smelling of barley and smoke. She tried to scream but swallowed porter instead. Her lungs burned. The baby cried once. The sound cut short as the flood smothered everything it touched. In the next cellar over, a group of boys who worked at the nearby stables had been playing dice. They'd stolen a candle from their employer and were laughing in its flickering light when the beer poured through the cracks in the wall. It came first as a trickle, then a hiss, and before they could move, it was at their knees, their waists, their chests. The candle went out. In the dark, they clawed for the stairs, but the door had already jammed shut under the pressure. Outside, the flood rolled past the tenements, turning the narrow alleys into canals. It filled the lowest windows like glasses, frothing at the greptos, sills. People shouted names, trying to find one another, but the only reply was the gurgle of liquid through the cobblestones. In places, the porter was so deep that even the gas lamps disappeared, their glow fading beneath the murky brown surface. When the water finally stopped rising, it left behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Hours later, when rescuers came with lanterns and ropes, they found the cellar doors swollen shut. They pried them open one by one, the hinges creaking, the smell rushing out, beer, earth, rot, and something heavier. Inside, they found bodies tangled together, faces turned upward as if still searching for air. Mary Sullivan was found with her arms around her children, her hair fanned out like seaweed. The rescuers said she looked almost peaceful, as though asleep in amber. They carried her out into the night, past the flickering lamps and the murmuring crowd. No one spoke. The beer lapped quietly at their boots, golden in the lamplight, indifferent to the lives it had taken. Word spread quickly. By morning, all of London knew that the flood had filled the cellars of Street Giles, drowning entire families where they slept. Some mocked it, a city drunk to death, but others fell silent, unable to shake the image of those trapped beneath the streets. In the days that followed, as the cleanup began, the rescuers worked their way deeper into the flooded homes. They called out before they entered, as if the dead might answer, and sometimes, in the dripping dark, it seemed as though they did a faint splash, a breath, a whisper rising from the black water. The cellar children, they called them later, the ones who never made it back to the light. Even after the beer had drained away, their ghosts seemed to linger. On quiet nights, the neighbors swore they could hear soft laughter beneath the floorboards, like bubbles rising through water. The sound of children still playing where the flood had taken them. At the corner of Great Russell Street stood the Tavistock Arms, a place of laughter and smoke, of spilt ale, and worn tables polished smooth by elbows and time. Every evening, its windows glowed amber through the London fog, and its sign, painted with a proud stag, creaked gently in the wind. It was the kind of place where a man could forget the weight of his day for the price of a pint. And on that October evening in 1814, the laughter was especially loud. A dozen labourers from the brewery were gathered inside, their pay packets freshly emptied into mugs of porter. The room was thick with pipe smoke and good spirits. The landlord, Mr. Shaw, wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days, grinning at a familiar chorus of songs. In the corner, an old fiddler played the same reel he'd played every night for 20 years. The smell of roasted meat drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the sweeter, darker perfume of beer. Outside, the fog rolled low and heavy across the street, blurring the gas lamps. Somewhere, far off, a sound like thunder echoed. A few of the men paused, mugs halfway to their lips, but no one paid it much mind. London always had its noises, carts overturning, barrels dropped, the crack of distant construction. "Probably one of ours gone leaky again," Shaw said, chuckling. "They'll be swimming in beer down at the brewery." Laughter followed, brief and untroubled. Then the floor shuddered. A single glass slid from the counter and shattered. The fiddler stopped playing mid-note. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then it came the sound of an oncoming tide, low and growing, filling the air with the rumble of inevitability. "What in God's?" someone began, but the rest was lost in the roar. The back wall of the tavern burst inward, exploding in a rain of brick and splinters. A torrent of dark porter crashed through the opening, sweeping everything in its path. Tables flipped, chairs splintered. The fire in the hearth hissed out in an instant. The fiddler's bow flew from his hand as he was carried backward into the flood. "Mr." Shaw reached for the counter, but the wave tore it from its moorings and sent it tumbling across the room. For a few seconds, the world was sound and motion, liquid thunder battering against walls that no longer stood. The patrons shouted, cursed, prayed, clawed for anything solid. One man managed to grasp the doorframe and haul himself upward, gasping for air, only to see the street outside already gone, nothing but the churning surface of beer. He was pulled under a moment later. When the noise subsided, the tavern was gone. The roof had collapsed inward, and the building had become a hollow basin filled with frothing porter. Only the uppermost rafters jutted from the surface, like ribs from a carcass. Hours later, when the rescuers came, they found the bodies pressed against the far wall, carried there by the force of the current. Mr. Shaw was among them, his apron still tied, his hand clutching the broken handle of a tankard. The fiddler's instrument was never recovered, only his bow, floating among the debris, its white horsehair tangled with straw and soot. The next morning, the sign of the Tavistock Arms still hung from its bracket, though the stag upon it was streaked brown and dripping. It swayed in the breeze over an empty lot, creaking faintly, as if sighing in exhaustion. For years afterward, drinkers passing that corner would stop and look down, uneasy. The new buildings that rose there could never quite keep tenants long. Workers swore that on damp nights, when the air was heavy with the smell of malt, you could still hear faint music beneath the stones, a fiddle's last note caught forever in the silence that followed. When the first surge tore through Street Giles, it took everything at ground-level streets, cellars, and the people within them. But above that chaos, a handful of souls clung to the rooftops, stranded between the earth and the black tide below. They would be the only witnesses to see the flood from above, to look down on a city suddenly transformed into a dark, trembling sea. One of them was Henry Turner, a lamplighter by trade. He had been halfway through his evening rounds when the brewery exploded. He saw it happen, the plume of steam, the rush of debris, the first impossible wave bursting down Tottenham Court Road. For a moment he stood frozen, the long pole still in his hand. Then instinct took over. He ran, the air filled with the smell of malt and smoke. Behind him came the sound of thunder growing louder with every step. He reached a low roof beside the Street Giles workhouse and scrambled up the drain pipe, boots slipping on the wet stone. By the time he pulled himself onto the tiles, the flood had already reached the street. He watched as it devoured the alley below, sweeping carts, barrels, and screaming figures into its path. It moved, not like water, but like something alive, heaving, surging, churning as if it meant to climb the walls. Across from him, on another rooftop, two washerwomen were huddled together under a chimney stack. Their laundry baskets had been swept from their yard, the white sheets now tangled in the current below, ghostly banners waving in the foam. The women held each other and prayed. One of them called out for her child, but her voice was swallowed by the roar. Further along, a young boy in a baker's apron clung to a weather vane, his small hands slick with porter. He had climbed up through a garret window when the flood reached his ankles. Now, trembling, he watched pieces of his home break apart beneath him, chairs, shutters, the family's bread oven, all swirling in the dark river. His mother's voice had been the last thing he heard before the wave carried her away. Henry Turner shouted to the boy, waving his lantern, "Stay put, lad, don't move." But the child didn't answer. He was staring down at the water, his face lit by the faint flame. Turner saw what he saw, the reflection of firelight dancing on the flood, and beneath it, something pale drifting past. He reached out a hand as if he could stop it, then he buried his face against the metal and sobbed. The rooftops became islands that night. Dozens gathered wherever they could find height, chimneys, dormers, window ledges. They shouted across the water, voices echoing in the hollowed silence between waves. Some tried to throw ropes to those still trapped on upper floors, but the beer was too heavy, dragging everything downward. A few desperate men leapt from window to window, trying to reach higher ground, only to vanish into the foam below. When the tide finally began to fall, the survivors stayed where they were. They didn't trust the stillness. The porter shimmered under the moonlight, glistening like oil, its surface littered with the remnants of a neighborhood, pots, books, dolls, limbs. From his perch, Turner could see all of it. The brewery, a wrecked skeleton, the tenements sagging like soaked paper, and beyond them, the faint glow of the city still alive, still unaware of what had happened here. Dawn came slowly. The survivors climbed down one by one, their boots sinking into the sticky residue that covered the cobbles. Turner descended last, his lantern long extinguished. The smell was unbearable. He walked the ruined street in silence, stepping over what the flood had left behind. Later, when asked what he remembered most, he didn't speak of the noise or the destruction. He spoke only of the view from the roof, the sight of London beneath him, drowning in its own invention, while the city beyond went on lighting its lamps as if nothing had changed. By morning, the flood had retreated, leaving behind a city that no longer sounded like London. The usual chorus of wheels, hawkers, and horses had vanished. In its place came the slow, sticky drip of beer from broken walls, and the murmurs of searchers picking through the ruins. The porter, now cooling in the autumn air, lay pooled in cellars and courtyards, a dark mirror reflecting a grey sky. The people of Street Giles walked barefoot through it, dazed, their clothes stiff with dried malt. It was the scavengers who found her. A pair of ragmen, wading through the wreckage in search of scrap iron, came upon a cluster of barrels piled against the corner of New Street. Most had splintered, their contents long gone, but one remained intact, half buried in a heap of debris, its sides split open just enough to reveal a patch of pale cloth. The men pried it apart with a crowbar, expecting salvage. What they uncovered instead was the small, still form of a child. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her hair, darkened by porter, clung to her face. Her dress was torn at the sleeve but neatly buttoned down the front, as though her mother had dressed her carefully that morning. She had been carried into the barrel by the force of the flood, rolled along the street, and wedged upright between the wreckage. The beer had kept her suspended there, cradled like a toy in a cradle of oak. When they found her, her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Word spread quickly. People gathered, drawn by a mixture of pity and morbid wonder. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered that she must have been one of the Mulvey children, swept from their tenement when the wave struck. The older women wept softly. The younger ones stared in silence. A constable arrived and ordered the crowd back, though he himself could not stop looking. The ragmen lifted the barrel onto a cart. As they did, the air filled again with that terrible sweetness, the smell of malt and death intertwined. The crowd turned away, coughing, pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths. The porter had soaked into everything. The cobbles, the bricks, the bodies. Even grief smelled of beer now. They took the girl to the yard behind the workhouse, where the other dead were being laid out. Someone covered her with a sheet, but the image lingered in every mind, the small figure in the barrel, found like a message from the flood itself. The newspapers would later call her the child in the cask, a phrase that sounded poetic until you remembered it was true. That evening, as the lanterns flickered against the wet walls, a priest came to bless the dead. He moved from body to body, whispering prayers. When he reached the girl, he paused, resting his hand on the barrel's rim. "May she sleep in peace," he said, his voice barely audible above the steady dripping from the roofs. Outside, the flood's remnants shimmered in the lamplight, thick and golden brown. Men with shovels worked in silence, scraping the congealed beer into trenches so it would drain toward the river. The porter that had drowned her would soon flow into the Thames and vanish, leaving only the smell behind. But the people of Street, Giles would remember. In the taverns rebuilt on dry ground, they would tell her story in low voices over pints of the same drink that killed her. Some said her ghost could be heard on quiet nights, rolling a barrel down the alley, laughing softly as if play had never ended. Others swore that when they raised a mug to their lips, the foam sometimes shaped a tiny hand reaching up from the depths. And though London soon went back to drinking, no one in Street, Giles ever poured porter again without seeing for an instant the face of the girl in the barrel. By the following afternoon, word of the disaster had spread beyond Street Giles. Londoners came by the hundreds, drawn by rumor and disbelief, to see the place where beer had drowned an entire parish. They arrived in carriages and on foot, men in fine coats and women in veils, their parasols lifted against the drizzle. The smell met them before the ruins did, sweet, heady, and wrong. It rolled through the streets like fog, clinging to skin and hair until even the curious began to gag. The floodplain had turned to a vast brown lagoon, glistening under a weak sun. Barrels floated amid chairs and timber, the debris of lives upturned. Houses leaned like drunks against one another, their bricks soft from saturation. The streets were slick, sticky underfoot. Each step released the faint hiss of trapped air rising through beer-soaked earth. The Meux Brewery loomed above it all, a blackened hulk split open like a carcass, its ribs of iron exposed. The constables had cordoned off the main lane, but the crowd pressed forward anyway. Vendors appeared almost immediately, selling handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar to mask the smell. Street urchins darted among the onlookers, holding out chips of splintered wood. "From the great vat!" they shouted. A piece of the monster. The gentleman bought them for pennies, turning the tragedy into souvenir. Reporters scribbled in notebooks. One from the Morning Chronicle asked a survivor how it had begun. The man, still wet to the knees, only stared at him, eyes hollow. "It began," he said slowly, with laughter. Then he walked away, leaving muddy footprints that glistened in the porter pooled between stones. A small group of women from a nearby church had come with blankets and bread for the displaced. They moved quietly among the crowd, faces pale, skirts lifted out of the muck. When they reached the ruined tenements, they stopped. The lower floors were gone entirely, the upper rooms hanging open like dolls' houses. A single curtain fluttered in the breeze, its lace-stained brown. One of the women crossed herself and began to cry. Further down the lane, men worked to haul debris from what had been the Tavistock Arms. They pulled up planks, furniture, and fragments of barrels. Every so often the work stopped as something pale surfaced. A hush would fall, the crowd leaning forward until the constables forced them back again. Each time, the same whisper passed through the throng, "Another one." Not everyone came to mourn. Some had come to taste. Boys cupped their hands in the puddles, laughing as they drank. A few of the poorer women filled jugs and buckets, muttering that it was a shame to waste good beer. By nightfall, many of them would be ill, retching in the alleys as the sweet, sour smell thickened with decay. At sunset, the sky turned the same color as the porter amber at the edges, black at the heart. The gas lamps flickered to life, reflecting on the still water that filled gutters. The crowd began to thin, but not before one last ripple of laughter rose from a group of soldiers who had come to gawk. "London'll never go thirsty again," one said, kicking at the muck. The words hung in the air, tasteless and cruel, but no one answered. When darkness finally fell, the constables ordered the streets cleared. The reporters folded their notes. The carriages rattled away. Only the locals remained, standing in doorways that no longer had doors, staring into the silence where their homes had been. The city had looked upon its own creation and recoiled, but the staring would not stop there. For days to come, people would visit the ruins, as if attending a theatre performance, London's newest spectacle, a play of death and excess, and in the rising stench of malt and misery, the line between fascination and shame blurred, until the living began to envy the silence of those who had gone under. While the people of Street Giles wandered through ruin, the men who owned the ruin were still behind closed doors. In a high, dry room above the wreckage, Samuel Meux, heir to the brewery fortune, sat at a table with his foreman and engineers. The shutters were drawn. The smell of malt seeped through anyway, curling beneath the door like guilt. No one spoke at first. The table was littered with ledgers, soaked maps, and a broken brass pressure gauge. A clerk stood at the window, peering through the slit between the curtains. "They're gathering outside again," he whispered. "Hundreds of them. Reporters, too." Meux pressed his hand against his temple. He was not a cruel man, nor particularly foolish, but he had been raised to think of beer the way kings thought of. Blood it flowed, it built empires, it made men loyal. That morning, his empire stank of death. "How many dead?" he asked. The engineer, Woodhouse's assistant, cleared his throat. "8 confirmed, sir. Possibly more in the lower quarters. We've lost the entire south wall, 3 vats, and the roof of the porterhouse. The damage—" "I asked about people, not property." Meux's voice cracked like glass. He looked down at his trembling hands, surprised by their betrayal. "God forgive us," he murmured. Old George Crick's name was already among the missing. The clerk said his body had not been found. Meux pictured the cooper, a man he had seen 100 times in passing, wiping his brow with that same rag, speaking softly to the barrels as if they were livestock. The idea that such a man could be swallowed by the very thing he served seemed grotesque impossible. One of the senior partners broke the silence. "We'll have to release a statement. A mechanical failure, perhaps, or an unforeseen accident. There's no use in assigning blame." "Blame," Meux repeated softly. "There will be plenty of that." The lawyer who had been summoned from Fleet Street was already uncapping his pen. "Legally speaking," he began, "the company cannot be held responsible. The courts will call this an act of God." An act of God. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Outside, a hammer clanged against iron as laborers began boarding up the breach. Meux rose from his chair and opened the shutters despite the protests. The sight struck him like a blow. The entire yard below was a glistening pit of wreckage. Men waded knee-deep through beer, dragging out shattered timber and bent metal hoops. From somewhere nearby came the sound of weeping. "An act of God," he said again. "No, gentlemen. This was the act of men who built too much and listened too little." The others averted their eyes. Numbers were safer than conscience, and soon they returned to their calculations. Cost of repairs, loss of inventory, compensation for the dead. Meux barely heard them. His thoughts were drowning in the noise outside, the shouts of searchers, the creak of carts, carrying bodies wrapped in sheets, the sickly laughter of bystanders who still smelled the sweetness of the beer and thought it a gift. He left the room before anyone could stop him. Down the stairwell, the odor grew stronger, thicker. At the foot of the steps, he saw what the clerks had avoided, describing the doorway blown apart, the vat's remains jutting like ribs, the street beyond glazed in brown. A constable recognized him and stiffened. "You'd best keep back, sir. Still not safe." But Meux stepped into the muck anyway. His boots sank. The porter lapped at the leather. He looked toward the tenements where women were still sweeping out their ruined homes, their eyes flat with exhaustion. One of them spat in his direction. It struck his coat and slid down in a dark line. He did not move. Later, when he finally returned to his office, he tore the company's ornate crest from the wall and threw it into the fire. The brass hissed and smoked, the malt scent deepening as it melted. Upstairs, the lawyer continued writing. the words smooth and certain. The Meux and Company Brewery regrets the unfortunate incident, caused by no fault of their own. Below those words, the ink dried in perfect lines, even as the city outside still stank of porter and death. By the time the constables reached Street Giles, the flood was already history. The porter had slowed to a thick, glutinous crawl, seeping into the cracks between cobblestones and pooling in the shadows of broken houses. The shouts were gone. The screams had long been swallowed. What remained was an eerie quiet, punctuated by the sound of dripping from rooftops, from beams, from the barrels that had rolled as far as Oxford Street before coming to rest. The first patrolman approached cautiously, boots sinking into the sticky residue. Their torches flickered in the mist. None of them had ever seen anything like it. The air was warm and cloying, thick with malt and smoke. It clung to their throats, coating their tongues until they felt half-drunk just breathing. One of them muttered, "God help us, it smells like a brewery died." Another crossed himself. Inspector Thomas Beresford led the group. He had been called from Bow Street after reports of an explosion. Probably a gas main, someone had said. But as he turned the corner onto New Street, his lantern revealed the truth. Whole buildings split open, their interiors exposed like wounds. Furniture floated in waist-high beer, glinting in the lamplight. A man's hat bobbed past, followed by a boot, a chair leg, and a dead cat. The inspector raised his hand. "Careful where you step," he said, though the words felt absurd. There was no safe place to step. They found the first body near the wall of the Tavistock Arms. A woman, young, face down in the porter, her hair spread like ink. Beresford knelt, rolling her gently onto her back. Her lips were pale, her eyes closed. She looked peaceful, almost asleep. He glanced around the ruined street, so many faces watching from doorways, silent. "Anyone know her?" he asked. No one answered. A man in a brewer's apron looked away. They moved on. A half-collapsed tenement had trapped several families inside. The constables pried loose the splintered boards, calling out into the darkness. The silence that followed was answer enough. When they finally opened the door, the smell hit them sweet, warm, and unmistakably human. Beresford turned away, swallowing hard. He had seen death before, but never one that smelled like celebration gone wrong. Further down the alley, two boys had climbed onto a toppled wagon. They were covered head to toe in dried porter, their eyes wide and glassy. "We heard it," one whispered, "like thunder, but closer." The inspector handed them each a blanket and told them not to look behind them. As the night deepened, more officers arrived. Lanterns multiplied until the ruins glowed like an underworld of gold and shadow. They marked the dead with chalk on walls, scrawling numbers that looked like curses. 8 bodies by midnight. They would find 2 more by morning. Reporters gathered near the brewery gates, their questions sharp, their notebooks ready. Beresford ignored them. He watched as the constables covered each victim with canvas sheets, the outlines small and fragile beneath. The crowd pressed closer, whispering. Some began to dip mugs into the remaining puddles, laughing as they drank. "Wicked waste otherwise," one said. Beresford tore the mug from his hand and hurled it into the muck. "Show some respect," he snapped. But respect had fled this street hours ago. When dawn broke, the inspector filed his first report by the light of a carriage lamp. He wrote of structural failure, of human error, of loss beyond measure. He ended with one simple line: "Police arrived too late to render aid." Then he closed his notebook and stood for a long time, listening to the city waking just beyond the reach of the flood. London was already moving on. Milkmen called, carts rattled, and the bells of Street Giles began to toll the morning hour. Yet here, amid the smell of beer and ruin, time had stopped. The constables removed their hats. For a moment, it almost felt like a funeral. And when they finally left, the porter still shimmered in the gutters, reflecting the pale dawn sky, silent proof that the law, like mercy, had come too late. The dawn that followed was too gentle for what it revealed. A pale sun rose over Tottenham Court Road, its light spilling through the fog and turning the wet ruins to amber. The streets of St. Giles glistened as though varnished, every cobblestone coated in a thin film of beer that caught the light like glass. The smell was everywhere, sweet, yeasty, thick as syrup. It filled lungs, clung to clothing, and soaked the very air until the whole district reeked of drink and decay. The flood had receded into the night, leaving silence in its wake. Where the porter had raged hours before, there was now only the soft drip of liquid falling from windowsills and the buzz of flies beginning their work. The city beyond had already begun to stir, vendors shouting, bells tolling, carriages rattling, but here, on the drowned streets, time hung still. The first to rise were the survivors. They emerged cautiously from the upper floors of half-collapsed houses, barefoot and hollow-eyed, stepping down into the sticky muck that had once been their street. Some carried what they could salvage: blankets, pots, a single photograph held tight as if these scraps could anchor them to life. Others simply stood, staring at what had been home. One woman sat on a doorstep that no longer led to a door, her face streaked with dried porter. She rocked a child's shoe in her hands, murmuring a name over and over until her voice cracked. An old man beside her was scraping beer-soaked grain from the curb with a tin plate, muttering that it would do for feed. In every corner, people were kneeling in the muck, searching for something, anything that hadn't been taken by the flood. At the ruins of the brewery, workers stood in stunned silence. Smoke still drifted from the shattered brick, the twisted iron hoops glinting like the skeleton of some monstrous beast. A few men tried to gather the debris into piles, but the smell drove them away. One of them gagged and leaned against a wall, whispering, "Christ Almighty, it's in my blood now." A priest arrived shortly after sunrise, the hem of his cassock darkened by the residue. He moved slowly among the dead laid out along the street, blessing each in turn. There were 8 in all, though whispers said more had vanished into the flood, their bodies carried toward the Thames or buried beneath the wreckage. The priest's voice trembled as he prayed, his words drowned by the sound of liquid dripping from the roofs. The city's scavengers came next, men and boys carrying buckets, tin cups, and jars. They scooped up what beer remained in the puddles, laughing at the absurdity of it. "Free drink for the taking," one shouted. Others joined in, gulping down the sticky dregs before stumbling away, half-drunk and weeping. The constables shouted for them to leave, but none listened. Poverty has always known how to drink sorrow. By mid-morning, a light wind stirred, carrying the smell eastward. Londoners, on their way to market, wrinkled their noses and muttered about the stink from St. Giles. Already, the story was spreading half-truths, exaggerations, jokes. Some said the beer had run like a river through Holborn. Others swore it had reached as far as the Strand. The reality was smaller, sadder, contained within a few streets, and yet it felt vast enough to drown the whole city's conscience. As the sun climbed higher, the porter dried into a sticky crust on windows and walls. Children scraped it away with spoons, curious, while their mothers shouted for them to stop. A few men rolled the empty barrels from the ruins, their hollow thuds echoing through the street like funeral drums. By noon, the priest was gone, the constables too. Life had begun to move again, cautiously, awkwardly, as though the city itself were learning to breathe. But the smell, God, the smell remained. It sank into brick and flesh alike, impossible to wash away. That evening, as dusk fell, a boy walking home from a sanking, work paused by the brewery gates. The air was quiet now, the puddles still. He knelt and touched the ground, feeling the faint stickiness on his fingers. When he held them to his nose, the scent was almost pleasant, warm, sweet, like the ghost of laughter. Then he remembered what the laughter had cost and wiped his hands on his coat. The beer had gone, but its ghost remained. London had sobered, and St. Giles would never forget. On the second morning after the flood, the city began to take inventory. The newspapers called it an unfortunate accident, though those who lived through it had other names. The drowning, the night of the porter, the brown tide. But no matter what they called it, the question now was how many? How many gone? How many left? How many never found at all? Constables moved from house to house with notebooks and quills, recording names whispered through tears. Families pointed to doorways that no longer stood, to windows where faces had once appeared. The ink ran with the damp, every name smeared like blood on paper. The coroner's office had been overwhelmed by dawn. The dead were laid out in rows inside the workhouse yard, their faces pale and shining in the weak sunlight. The air was thick with vinegar and beer, one to fight infection, the other unshakable. A clerk stood beside the priest, marking down each body brought in. One woman, 34, one boy, 10, one girl, unknown, found in a barrel. One man, laborer, presumed brewery hand. People came searching for their missing, carrying bits of clothing or scraps of ribbon, anything to match to what the flood had taken. A man recognized his wife by her ring, blackened by beer. Another found his brother by the shape of his boots. For some, there was nothing left to recognize at all, only the faint suggestion of a face, the body bloated by the sweet poison that had killed it. The brewery sent carriages draped in black cloth to collect the dead. Few wanted to see them. When the first cart passed down Tottenham Court Road, people stopped and stared, but no one bowed. The sound of the wheels in the dried porter made a sucking noise, like the city itself refused to let go. At the yard, a woman knelt beside a shrouded form, her hands trembling as she lifted the edge of the sheet. She made no sound at first, only rocked back and forth, her lips pressed against the fabric. Then came the cry, a sound that seemed to rise from the bricks themselves. The other mourners lowered their heads. No one spoke. By the end of the day, the official count stood at 8. 8 dead in the flood, 2 more succumbing to injuries soon after. But the people of Street Giles knew better. They whispered of others, beggars who lived in the alleys, children without names, souls too poor to be tallied. The porter had taken them quietly, without witness or record. They'll never count the ones the city forgot, an old woman said, spitting into the gutter. In Parliament, the event was already being turned into statistics. Barrels lost, property destroyed, cost of damages. The language of tragedy had been translated into ledgers, but here, among the ruins, the numbers were not clean. They were carved into memory, weighted with smell and silence. When the sun set, the constables packed their ledgers and went home. The priest covered the last of the dead and doused the lanterns. In the yard, the beer had dried to a sticky glaze on the stones, dark and glimmering. A single fly buzzed in the quiet. Later that night, one of the survivors, the lamplighter Henry Turner, walked the ruined street again. He had lit every lamp along Tottenham Court Road as he always did, his steps echoing in the hush. When he reached the brewery gates, he stopped and looked down. The light reflected on the ground in uneven patches where the porter had pooled and dried, forming the shape of something almost human. He counted the lamps, the houses, the shadows. He tried to count the dead again too, whispering the names he could remember. When he reached 9, he faltered. There were more, he was sure of it, but memory, like water, had already begun to slip away. The night wind stirred, carrying the scent of malt through the street once more. Henry closed his notebook, his hand shaking slightly, and walked on. The counting was done, but the losing never would be. By the third day, the parish bells of Street Giles tolled without pause. Their dull clangs rolled over the rooftops like a heartbeat, slow and hollow, reminding every soul within earshot that death had work to finish. The floodwaters were gone, yet the scent of it, malt and rot and iron, lingered in the church's stones, clinging even to the hymn books and vestments. The city above had begun to move on, but the parish could not. The churchyard was a tangle of black-clad figures. Women in damp mourning dresses clutched handkerchiefs that smelled faintly of porter, their veils fluttering in the cold wind. Children stared at the ground, their small hands gripping their mothers' skirts. Men stood rigid, caps in hand, eyes red not just from grief but from the air itself, heavy with yeast, sweet and nauseating. Even the crows avoided the place, circling instead above the brewery's wrecked roof where the smell was stronger. Father Wilkes led the service. He was an old man, stooped, tired, with a voice that trembled like candlelight. His words carried over the crowd, though few seemed to hear them. "We commend these souls to God," he said, "and pray for mercy on the living." Behind him, 8 coffins waited in a row, plain wood, unpainted, already darkened by the moisture in the air. The smallest one lay at the center, no larger than a trunk, its edges still sticky from where it had touched the porter-soaked ground. The names were read aloud, one by one, the priest's tone steady, though his hands shook on the book. Mary Mulvey, Thomas Sullivan, Ellen Sullivan, Rose Sullivan. Each name was a blade that passed through the crowd. At every pause, someone sobbed. At John Perry, there was silence. The brewery workers bowed their heads. When Father Wilkes reached "Unknown Child," recovered from a barrel, the wind itself seemed to stop. The coffins were lowered into the ground side by side, the ropes creaking softly. The soil beneath was still, damp, and smelled faintly of beer. It clung to the gravedigger's boots in thick brown clumps. As the last handfuls of earth fell, the priest crossed himself and murmured the closing words, though his voice broke before he finished. A hush followed. The only sound was the gentle slosh of water in the ditch nearby and the flutter of crows' wings. Then, slowly, the people began to move, filing past the graves, some crossing themselves, others touching the wood as if to promise remembrance. A brewer's widow placed a sprig of heather on the smallest coffin. She liked the smell of bread baking, she whispered. Not this. The bells tolled again as they left, echoing through the narrow lanes of Street Giles. The crowd thinned, swallowed by the fog, leaving only the priest and 2 constables. Father Wilkes knelt by the graves, his knees sinking into the soft earth. He stayed there for a long while, whispering a prayer meant as much for himself as for the dead. When he finally rose, he turned toward the church. Inside, the candles burned low, their flames flickering beneath soot-stained arches. The pews were empty save for one old man, Henry Turner, the lamplighter, sitting alone, hat in hand. The priest approached him. "You should rest," he said. Turner shook his head. "Someone should keep the lamps burning. It's too dark down there." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of malt and grief toward the river. The city continued its business, indifferent, but in Street Giles, every breath was a prayer, every sound an echo of the flood. The parish had become a monument of the living, a place where sorrow did not fade but fermented, dark and heavy, waiting for time to bottle it into memory. And as night fell, the bells rang once more, not in warning or alarm, but in weary acknowledgement of what the city had lost and what it had learned to forget. In the week that followed, the bells of Street Giles fell silent, not out of peace, but exhaustion. The parish had buried its dead, the brewery had swept its ruins into neat piles, and London, ever restless, was already swallowing the story whole. Yet inside the church, where the air should have been clean with incense and hymn, the smell of malt clung to the very stone. It crept into the wood of the pews, the folds of the altar cloth, even into the priest's robes. The scent became a second presence, one that refused to leave, one the church could not name. Father Wilkes knew confession could ease most sins, but not this. The brewery had offered reparations, modest payments, spoken apologies, but no absolution could come from coin. Still, the church gave its silence freely. When the newspapers came asking for sermons, for some divine explanation of the event, the clergy declined. It was the will of God, one bishop wrote in a tidy letter to the Times. Such matters are beyond our judgment. Wilkes read those words at his desk, his fingers trembling on the page. The ink was perfect, the phrasing polite, but to him it sounded like cowardice dressed as faith. He thought of the families who still came to his doors each morning, the widows, the orphaned, the half-mad survivors who could no longer bear the smell of beer without retching, and wondered what kind of God could drown the poor in what they had brewed for others. On Sunday, the pews were nearly full. Curiosity had replaced piety. Londoners who had never stepped inside Street Giles before came to see the faces of the survivors. They sat in clean clothes that smelled of lavender and coal smoke, watching with polite solemnity as Wilkes climbed the pulpit. He looked out at them, all those strangers, all those eyes waiting for him to explain, and for a long moment he could not speak. The words of his sermon, written carefully the night before, lay folded in his hand like an accusation. He opened his ruven mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched until someone coughed, and another shifted in the pew. Finally, he said quietly, "We have buried the bodies, but not the cause." A murmur rippled through the congregation. "You wish to call it tragedy, accident, the will of heaven, but you know better. It was built by hands that never feared the weight of what they made. It was pride, and profit." Gasps. Then a hiss of disapproval from the front rows. The wealthier parishioners frowned, whispering to one another. Wilkes continued, his voice roughening with each word. "God did not fill those vats. Men did. And men left them to swell until they broke. The Lord teaches us that sin can ferment as surely as grain. Leave it long enough, and it will burst forth and drown all it touches." A woman stood, clutching her shawl. "You speak blasphemy," she said. "You blame men for God's wrath." Wilkes's eyes softened. "Madam," he said, "I am not sure there is a difference anymore." The congregation erupted. Some left in outrage, others stayed, weeping quietly. The old priest leaned against the pulpit, his hands gripping the wood. He knew he would not be asked to speak again. After the service, the bishop's messenger arrived, crisp and cold as marble, bearing a letter that asked Father Wilkes to consider rest. By evening, the church doors were locked. The next Sunday, a younger priest took the pulpit. His sermon was shorter, cleaner, and careful. Outside, the parish of Street Giles carried on, but the windows of the church fogged over with the scent of porter each time it rained, and those who passed claimed they could hear the faint echo of Wilkes's final sermon in the wind. Not words of wrath or comfort, but a single truth whispered beneath the bells. Some disasters are not acts of God at all, they are prayers that were never answered, spoken too late. In the language of regret, the coroner's inquest was held 9 days after the flood, in a rented hall that smelled faintly of damp wood and old ink. The benches were full journalists, city clerks, curious citizens, even a handful of brewery workers who had come on their day off. Outside, children sold pamphlets calling it the Great London Beer Calamity, their voices cutting through the chill November air. Inside, the mood was heavier. Everyone seemed to understand that what happened in this room would decide not only who was to blame, but who would be allowed to forget. At the front sat the coroner, spectacles glinting under the gaslight, his quill poised like a weapon. Before him stood the representatives of Meux and Company, lawyers in black coats, their papers stacked like fortifications. Beside them, Samuel Meux himself, pale and drawn, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked less like an industrial baron than a man attending his own funeral. The first witnesses were the laborers' men who had heard the cracks, seen the iron hoops shake, felt the pressure build. They spoke in low voices, hats twisting in their hands. "We told him it was straining," said one. "Said she'd not hold another week." Another nodded. The cooper said the wood was tired, been weeping for days. Each statement drew murmurs from the crowd. The coroner scribbled, the lawyers frowned. Then the chief engineer took the stand. He described the vat's size, its strength, its flawless record. An unfortunate mechanical failure, he called it. No man could have foreseen such an event. When asked about maintenance, he hesitated. "We followed every protocol," he said, though his eyes did not rise from the floor. Finally, it was Meux's turn. The room fell silent as he stood. He was not used to speaking without an audience of allies. His voice wavered at first, then steadied. "Gentlemen," he began, My family has brewed in this city for half a century. Our porter is the pride of London, the drink of her working men. What occurred was an act beyond human control, a misfortune of physics and providence. A reporter coughed pointedly. Providence? He muttered. Meux continued, his tone firmer now. We grieve for the dead, as any Christian men must. We have provided for the families, covered the burial expenses, and given relief to the survivors. But the company cannot be held liable for what God himself decreed. If blame is to be cast, it lies with fate, not with men who serve the public's thirst. A wave of whispers swept the room. The coroner leaned forward. So you contend this disaster was divine will? I contend, Meux said, his jaw tightening, that London is built upon risk. Every invention, every progress, every miracle of industry carries the chance of misfortune. Must we halt advancement for fear of it? Must every broken wheel or burst pipe be met with accusation? The coroner's pen scratched. Not accusation, sir, accountability. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. The jury conferred in hushed tones. When they returned, the verdict came quickly, predictably. No negligence, no malice. A pure accident, an act of God. The words rippled through the hall. Some sighed in relief, others cursed under their breath. Meux closed his eyes and exhaled, though the sound came out closer to a sob. When he stepped outside, the reporters surrounded him, their pens ready. Sir, what will you say to the families? One shouted. He paused, the gaslight catching the lines of exhaustion on his face. There is nothing I can say, he murmured. Words will not drain the river nor wake the drowned. That night, the papers carried the verdict on their front pages. The headline read, Beer flood ruled an act of God, and with that, the city exhaled in collective absolution. The courts had spoken, and London, hungry for progress, thirsty for forgetfulness, was ready to drink again. But in Street Giles, the smell lingered. No verdict could wash it away. The verdict rang through the streets like a closing bell. Act of God, the papers said. The brewery absolved. The matter settled. The great city shrugged, grateful that guilt could be written off so neatly. But in the narrow alleys of Street Giles, where the porter had left its stain, no one was fooled. God had nothing to do with it. It was the work of men with ledgers instead of hearts, men who had never set foot in the rooms they drowned. The widows gathered in the tavern ruins the day after the inquest. The tavern had been scrubbed as best as possible, though the smell of malt still lingered in the cracks. 8 women sat on overturned barrels, their hands folded in their laps. Most wore black, not because mourning suited them, but because it was all they had. Their names were Mary Keane, Ellen Duffy, Margaret Shaw, and others the city would not remember. They spoke softly, their voices thin and tired. They say we should be thankful, Ellen whispered. The breweries sent us, each a shilling and a loaf of bread. For our troubles, Mary snorted, a hard, bitter sound. For our dead, you mean? They said it weren't their fault, Margaret added. Said the Lord made it happen. At that, another woman, a girl barely 20, laughed, though it sounded more like choking. Then the Lord must have been drunk that night. The laughter died quickly. Outside, the street bustled with life again, cartwheels clattering, vendors calling, the city moving on. To the rich districts, the flood had become a curiosity, a story told in pubs far from the smell of ruin. But here, the walls still wept. A few of the men had spoken of taking their grievance higher, petitioning the magistrates, perhaps even Parliament. But they didn't know where to begin. Lawyers cost money, and none of them had enough to feed themselves. When they approached one clerk about filing a claim, he shook his head. The brewery's cleared. You'll not win, he said. Best. Let it rest. Let it rest. The words echoed through the tenements. The people of Street Giles had long lived under laws they didn't write and punishments they didn't deserve. They'd seen landlords raise rents, policemen beat their sons, and now brewers flood their homes, all without consequence. Justice was a game for men who could afford to lose. For everyone else, silence was cheaper. Still, one woman refused to let the silence settle. Her name was Nora Mahoney. Her husband had worked at the brewery and was buried 3 days before the inquest. She went every morning to the factory gates, her black shawl pulled tight, demanding to see Mr. Meux. The guards turned her away each time. On the 5th morning, she spat on the gate and shouted, "You killed him with your pride." Before being dragged off by constables, the newspapers called her hysterical. In Street, Giles, they called her brave. That night, a group of workers gathered in the cellar of a half-collapsed building. They once passed around a candle and spoke in whispers. "They think we'll forget," one said. "They think we'll drink their beer again and sing their songs." A voice from the dark replied, "We've no choice, have we? The poor always drink what the rich spill." For a moment, no one spoke. The candle sputtered. Outside, a church bell rang, muffled by the fog. When they finally rose to leave, Nora stayed behind. She placed her hand on the damp brick wall and whispered, "Then we'll remember, even if no one else does." And she did. Every year on the flood's anniversary, she laid a sprig of rosemary by the gates of the brewery. No one else came. The guards ignored her, but on the mornings after, workers said they could smell rosemary in the yard, sharp and clean, cutting through the sweet stench of beer. The city never wrote her name, but Street Giles remembered, because when the law refused to speak, the poor told their own truth in silence, in stubbornness, and in the scent of a flower that would not die. By the time winter crept over London, the beer flood had become a story, not a wound, not a warning, just a story. The taverns, rebuilt and reopened, were full once more, their windows glowing through the fog like embers refusing to die. The smell of porter returned to the streets, lighter now, fresher, without the heaviness of death clinging to it. And though the people of Street Giles still wrinkled their noses when the brewery chimneys smoked, the rest of the city had gone back to drinking. The first toast came barely a month after the inquest. In a pub, just 2 streets from the ruins, men lifted their mugs high and laughed. "To Providence," someone said, grinning, and the room erupted with applause. The joke traveled fast everywhere. Men repeated it, turning tragedy into entertainment. Even the newspapers joined in, publishing cartoons of fat brewers chasing after rivers of beer, of Londoners swimming in barrels marked Meux's best. Samuel Meux tried to ignore it. His lawyers assured him the company's reputation would recover quickly. "People will drink what's put before them," one said. "They always have." And he was right. Within weeks, sales of porter began to climb again. Pubs that had once shuttered their doors now boasted of carrying Meux's genuine porter strong as ever. The irony went unnoticed. But in Street Giles, the laughter never quite reached. The survivors watched the barrels roll by with a bitterness that no drink could drown. The brewery wagons still rattled through the streets, their wheels leaving brown streaks where the flood had run. Each creak of a cart axle was a reminder. Each hiss of steam from the brewery's vats was a ghost breathing. Henry Turner, the lamplighter, passed the gates every evening on his rounds. He saw the workers file in, their faces new, their steps brisk. No one spoke of the dead anymore. The brewery's paint was fresh, the windows polished, the new vats gleaming like promises. He sometimes paused, looking up at the rebuilt facade, and imagined he could still hear the faint moan of the old iron bands giving way. When he mentioned it once to a brewer, the man laughed. "You're hearing wind, not ghosts." But Turner only nodded. He had heard both before. The pubs were loud again. The poor, as always, sought comfort in the same thing that had undone them. The first sip of porter burned their throats, sweet and sharp, but it dulled the ache of memory. What choice did they have? Hunger still stalked the same alleys. Rent was still due on the same crumbling rooms. A man could curse the brewers and still lift a mug to his lips the same night. By Christmas, even the church had loosened its silence. Father Wilkes, though officially retired, attended Mass one last time. He sat at the back, listening as the new curate gave a sermon on forgiveness. The priest spoke of God's mercy and man's endurance, but when the congregation left, Wilkes remained behind. He whispered, "Forgive them if you must. I cannot," and crossed himself before walking into the fog. The taverns were full that night. Songs rose into the air, loud, off-key, but full of life. People sang to forget. They toasted to prosperity, to industry, to London herself. The city joined in, its chimneys sighing out smoke and steam, its windows flickering with lamplight. And somewhere beyond the laughter, beyond the ringing mugs and slurred blessings, the old brewery loomed against the night sky, its new vats sealed tight, its doors locked for the evening. From inside came the low hum of pressure building once more, steady and unseen, like the heartbeat of a city that had learned nothing. The porter flowed again. The coins changed hands. London drank deeply, eager to prove it could survive anything, even itself. The morning edition of the Times hit the streets just as the city began to stir. Paperboys shouted headlines into the cold air, their voices echoing between the fog-damp walls. Verdict rendered, brewery cleared, a melancholy occurrence in Street Giles. By breakfast, the story had already travelled from Whitechapel to Westminster. In the coffee houses where clerks and merchants gathered, the beer flood had become conversation rather than catastrophe. The article filled a single column on the third page. No illustration, no outcry, just neat paragraphs in the dispassionate prose of men who believed tragedy could be measured in inches of print. It described the event as singular, the victims as unfortunate, and the brewery as a respectable establishment suffering an unavoidable misfortune. It ended with a line that seemed to erase everything that had come before. The matter is now closed. In the poorer quarters, people read it aloud at street corners, the wet paper staining their fingers. Some laughed bitterly, others spat on the headline. "Now closed," one woman muttered, showing the page to her neighbor, as if they could close what they'd done. But most said nothing. Words didn't drain the cellars or bring back the dead. They folded the paper for kindling and let it burn. Across town, in drawing rooms lined with books and brass, the same article was met with mild fascination. "Terrible business," said a banker over toast. But really, what luck it was. Beer and not fire. His wife shuddered politely, then asked whether the porter would rise in price. At the gentlemen's clubs, men in waistcoats debated the physics of the accident. Wood expansion, one argued. Pressure, another countered. No one mentioned poverty. No one spoke of the families buried in the parish yard. Reporters, freed from the burden of outrage, began to write with amusement. The Chronicle published a sketch of a rotund brewer floating down the street in a beer barrel, smiling like Bacchus. Satirists made verses about London's grand libation. The laughter of the wealthy became another kind of flood, quieter, colder, and more lasting. Only a handful of papers tried to tell the truth. The Morning Herald printed the testimony of a surviving child, a small paragraph tucked beneath an advertisement for corsets. The water came dark and hot, and Mother told us to climb the chair, but it took her first. Few read that far. The same edition carried a half-page advertisement for Meux Porter on the back, boasting of London's favourite brew. The irony went unnoticed, or perhaps it was simply forgiven. By the week's end, the headlines had moved on to Parliament, to a murder in Clerkenwell, to the fog choking the river. The flood became just another curiosity, its name reduced to shorthand for spectacle. Even the reporters who had stood in the ruins found themselves forgetting the smell. Yet in Street Giles, every copy of the paper was read until the ink ran and the edges turned soft. The people kept the pages not as news but as evidence, a record that the city could see their suffering and still call it melancholy. Some tucked the articles behind cracked mirrors or between Bible pages. Others used them to wrap bread, so that even the act of eating reminded them of what had been lost. When night fell and the lamps lit the wet streets, The wind picked up a few of those papers and carried them through the alleys. They fluttered against the brewery wall, plastered there by rain. The ink bled, the words dissolving until only a single line remained legible. A melancholy occurrence. It shivered in the lamplight like an epitaph, thin, proper, and utterly insufficient. By the first spring after the flood, the Meux Brewery was back to work. The smell of scorched wood and stale porter still clung to the brickwork, but the hammers had already begun to ring again. The city's appetite for beer had not faltered, and neither had the owner's hunger for profit. A new vat was to be built larger, safer, grander than the one that had burst. Its completion would mark not remembrance, but recovery. London did not linger on its sorrows, it paved over them, one rivet at a time. The labourers arrived before dawn each day, their boots sinking into the same courtyard where the flood had begun. Some had worked there before the disaster, others were new Irishmen down from Liverpool, a few veterans looking for steady pay. They were paid by the hour and asked no questions. The foreman, a stout man named Briggs, barked orders in the chill morning air. "The quicker we build it, the quicker we forget it," he said, though his eyes avoided the far wall where the old vat had ruptured. The wreckage had been cleared, but ghosts lingered in the cracks. The men swore that when the air was still, they could hear a faint groaning in the ground like a distant heartbeat. The older workers avoided the spot, spitting over their shoulders for luck. "Bad soil," one muttered. "Once drowned, never dry again." The new vat rose piece by piece, its wooden staves hauled up by pulleys, polished and sealed with iron hoops that gleamed like new coins. It would hold even more than the last nearly 2 million pints, the newspapers bragged. The brewery's investors insisted it be a monument to modern engineering, proof that industry could not be undone by tragedy. But for the men who worked beneath its shadow, it felt less like progress and more like defiance. At midday, they ate their meals in silence, hard bread and cheese, the smell of yeast thick around them. Occasionally someone would joke, half-heartedly, about drowning in drink. The laughter came, short, then faded. When rain fell, it mixed with the scent of drying malt until the whole yard smelled faintly of memory. Briggs was careful to keep the men busy, to leave no room for talk of the dead. Yet one afternoon, when the foreman turned away, a young carpenter named Liam asked quietly, "Do you ever think about them?" "About who?" "The ones who died." An older worker wiped his hands on his apron. "Don't start, lad. The dead don't care, and the living can't afford to." But Liam persisted. "My mother said her cousin lived on New Street. She never came home." The yard fell silent. The hammering stopped. Even Briggs froze, his back turned. For a moment, only the wind moved low and restless, carrying with it the faint smell of something sweet, decaying. Then Briggs snapped, "Get back to work." By dusk, the new vat stood completed in its frame, a monstrous shape of gleaming iron and varnished oak. The men stepped back, hats in hand, squinting against the last light. It was magnificent in the way a tomb can be. When the last bolt was driven, Briggs nodded to the clerk. "Note it down. Job finished." The clerk dipped his pen, scrawling the final words in the company ledger. April 1815, main vat replaced, capacity increased, construction sound. That night, when the brewery lamps were extinguished, the yard fell quiet. Rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the wood. Beneath the new vat, the earth was still damp, dark, sticky, and faintly sweet. And though no one would ever admit it aloud, a few of the men swore later that as they walked away, they heard something deep within the wood, a sound not of settling timber, but of breathing long, patient, and waiting. By summer, the streets of Street Giles looked clean again. The beer had long dried, the broken bricks had been replaced, and the laughter of market women once more drifted through the lanes. Yet no amount of scrubbing could erase what had soaked into the pores of the city. The flood had seeped into more than the foundations, it had entered the walls, the wood, even the dreams of those who still slept nearby. Every rain brought the smell back. It would start faintly, a sweetness under the stone, and by nightfall it would fill every room. "Smells like wages," the brewers joked, but to the people of Street Giles it smelled of graves. Housekeepers poured vinegar on the floors, burned bundles of sage, and scrubbed their stoops until their hands blistered. Still, the scent returned warm, heavy, unmistakable. It came with the damp, rose from the cellars, and lingered in curtains and coats. Even the church pews carried it, faint but constant, like the memory of a song you cannot stop humming. Margaret Shaw, widow of the tavern keeper, spent every evening washing the same flagstones outside what was left of the Tavistock Arms. Her husband had died behind that counter, his body pulled from the wreck 3 days after the flood. Each time she scrubbed, she watched the water turn brown. "It's still there," she whispered, "right under the skin." Her neighbors tried to comfort her, but the truth was plain. The porter had seeped into everything. Children dared one another to lick the walls, laughing at the bitter taste that never faded. In summer heat, the smell thickened until the air felt drunk. Stray dogs wandered through the alleys, noses low, drawn by a sweetness they didn't understand. At night, when the wind turned from the west, the scent would drift beyond Street Giles, brushing the nostrils of Londoners who had already forgotten what it meant. They would wrinkle their noses and mutter about that brewery smell, without thinking where it came from. The city's masons began to notice strange marks appearing on the stone near the brewery. Dark streaks, fine as veins, spreading across the walls like bruises. Rain only deepened them. One mason tried limewashing the facade, but within a month the stains had bled through again, faint but stubborn. He shrugged and said it was the iron in the water. Others whispered it was something else, the earth remembering. Inside the brewery, the workers said little. They polished the vats until they gleamed, but when they turned away, they swore the polish dulled overnight. The walls still wept in certain places, tiny beads of moisture gathering even on dry days. The new vat hummed faintly when the temperature changed. "Just settling," the foreman said. But the men avoided that corner of the yard after dusk. When autumn came, the first fog rolled down Tottenham Court Road. It crawled low and golden under the gaslight, carrying the familiar sweetness with it. From the tenements, people closed their shutters and lit candles. They said the smell was stronger that year. One woman crossed herself and whispered, "They're still with us." That night, the rain began again, a slow, steady drizzle that washed the streets clean but never dry. In the morning, the cobblestones gleamed with a faint, sticky sheen, as if the city had been crying in its sleep. Passers-by stepped carefully, puzzled by the slipperiness, and those who knew simply looked away. The flood was gone. The brewery thrived. The city prospered. But in the heart of Street Giles, beneath the freshly whitewashed walls and the repaired roofs, the scent of malt and sorrow remained quiet, patient, indelible. The stains would not wash. They were part of London now, written into its breath. Among those who lived through the flood, few were changed more than Henry Turner, the lamplighter. Before that night, he had been a man of simple habits, steady, sober, unremarkable. His work was quiet and precise. Every dusk, he walked his route through Tottenham Court Road and Street Giles, pole in hand, striking each gas lamp alive in a ritual of soft light. He took pride in it, this small act of order in a city that often seemed built from chaos. But after the flood, Henry could no longer bear the sound of hissing flame. It reminded him of the rush, the roar of beer breaking through brick, the hiss of boiling liquid swallowing the world. He did not speak of it. Men in those days did not. But the dreams came regardless. Every night he saw the same vision, a vast, dark sea where London should be. The lamps along the streets burned underwater, their light bending, their glass trembling. In the distance, the brewery loomed like a cathedral, its vats glowing faintly from within. From its doors, beer poured endlessly, not in rage now, but in silence, rising and rising until it reached his chest, his chin, his mouth. When he woke, his pillow was wet with sweat. and his heart beat in time with the sound of dripping outside. During the day, Henry still lit the lamps, though he moved slower now. He no longer whistled as he worked. The city noticed. "You've gone quiet, Turner," a constable said one evening. "You used to sing." Henry gave a half smile. Used to be worth singing for. The new brewery vat stood gleaming behind the walls, larger than the first, its iron hoops polished like mirrors. Each night, as Henry passed, he felt its presence behind the gate, an invisible pressure, as though the thing were breathing. The smell of malt hung heavier near it. He sometimes stopped and looked through the bars, his lantern casting a faint light on the slick cobblestones within. Once, he thought he saw movement, a shadow gliding just beneath the ground, like water running where no drain should be. When the nightmares worsened, he stopped sleeping altogether. The doctor at the parish infirmary told him it was nerves. "You've got the flood stuck in your head," the man said kindly. "It'll fade. It always does." But it didn't. The dreams followed him into waking. When it rained, he heard the flood again, faint and rhythmic, as if the ground beneath London still carried the memory of that night's current. On a fog-heavy evening in November, exactly a year after the flood, Henry paused at his last lamp of the route. He struck the flame, watched it catch, and listened. There it was again, the sound, low and pulsing, rising from the ground. He turned toward the brewery. The gates were closed, but the air seemed to move. The puddles on the street trembled. He whispered to no one, "It's coming back." A woman passing by laughed softly. "The rain's coming," more like. Henry nodded, but he didn't move. He stood there, long after the woman had gone, staring at the gates, waiting for the sound to stop. It never did. When he finally returned home, he set his lamp pole by the door and sat on his bed, boots still on, clothes still damp. He stared at the wall and listened to the faint dripping of rain outside his window. In the half-dark, he thought he saw water running down the plaster, though when he reached out to touch it, the wall was dry. In his final years, the neighbors said Henry had gone strange, speaking less, sleeping less, muttering about tides that moved beneath the city. Some nights they found him standing ankle-deep in the street after a storm, staring into the gutters, whispering as if answering a call only he could hear. When he died, they found no family, no savings, only his lantern and a small notebook. Inside, a single sentence repeated across the last page in an unsteady hand. "It's still flowing." The scent of baking bread was the only thing that could still cut through the lingering sweetness of malt in Street Giles. It came from a single shop near the parish wall, a narrow, soot-darkened bakery run by Eleanor Hayes, who everyone simply called the widow. Her husband, Thomas, had worked as a drayman for the Meux Brewery. When the flood came, he was found 3 streets away, his hand still gripping the reins of a horse that never surfaced. Eleanor had buried him without a stone. Stones cost money. Instead, she baked. At first, it was for survival, kneading dough in the half-collapsed kitchen where the smell of porter still clung to the beams. But soon the bread became something else, a ritual of resistance. Each morning before sunrise, she mixed the yeast, salt, and water with a precision born of grief. Her hands were steady, though her eyes often glistened in the lamplight. The bread rose as the city stirred. People said her loaves had a sweetness that none other could match. They never guessed the secret. She kneaded them with beer instead of water. It was what Thomas had loved. Most dark porter bread, thick and rich, the scent filling the house on cold nights. "If the city won't stop stinking of beer," she'd mutter, "then I'll make it pay me for it." By noon, the line outside her door stretched down the street. Children waited with halfpennies clutched in small fists. The workers from the brewery came too, embarrassed but hungry. Eleanor served them without a word. She wrapped each loaf in paper and placed it on the counter with hands that never shook. Some swore they caught a faint smile beneath her veil, but no one dared to mention her husband. She had written a sign above her door that read, "Hayes Bakery, honest bread." The word honest was underlined twice. It was a quiet defiance, a sermon disguised as commerce. When a city official stopped by one afternoon and suggested she use water again, said the smell of beer was distasteful, she met his gaze with such cold calm that he stammered an apology and left. At night, when the ovens cooled and the street lamps flickered against the windows, Eleanor would sit by the open door, her apron still dusted with flour, and watch the brewery's chimneys smoke in the distance. Sometimes she imagined Thomas walking up the street, shoulders broad, calling her name through the fog. She'd close her eyes and listen, but the only sound was the hiss of the oven bricks cooling, like a sigh. One autumn evening, a group of students from the university came to taste the widow's beer bread. They were loud and careless, laughing about the old flood. Eleanor served them as always, polite but silent. When one of them asked, between mouthfuls, "Is it true you lost your husband in that beer mess?" she paused for the first time all day. The bakery grew very still. Then she said quietly, "No, gentlemen, London lost him." After they left, she scrubbed the counter until her hands bled. She didn't cry. She hadn't since the week of the flood. But the smell that rose from the cracked wooden boards, yeast, malt, and something faintly metallic made her heart clench. By winter, her bakery had become part of the rhythm of the parish. People said that as long as Eleanor baked, Street Giles would not forget. On the anniversary of the flood, she rose before dawn and baked an extra loaf. She took it to the churchyard and placed it on Thomas's grave, whispering, "For you, love," still warm. As she turned to go, the fog curled low around her feet, and the faintest hint of sweetness drifted from the earth malt mingling with bread, sorrow with sustenance. The widow closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and for the first time in years, the scent did not make her flinch. It smelled, if only for a heartbeat, like forgiveness. By the middle of the century, when London had begun to shed its soot-stained skin and call itself modern, the old lanes of Street Giles were already fading from the maps. The flood had not only killed people, it had loosened the very ground they'd lived on. The cellars never truly dried, and the bricks, long since saturated with beer, began to crumble from within. Engineers called it structural fatigue. The people who still lived there called it the rot. New Street, where the water had hit hardest, was the first to vanish. At first, they simply renamed it an old trick of the city, to bury shame beneath a fresh heading. But renaming wasn't enough. The stench persisted. Even decades later, when the breweries had moved westward and the Meux family spoke of expansion and innovation, the ground of Street Giles refused to forget. Its drains overflowed whenever it rained. Rats scurried through old foundations that still smelled faintly of malt. Builders complained of the damp rising through their boots. In 1858, the council ordered the whole block demolished. Notices appeared on the doors. UNFIT for habitation. The families who lived there packed what they could carry: iron pots, portraits, a few bundles of clothing, and moved east toward Holborn, where rent was cheaper and the air marginally cleaner. A few refused to go. "This is our street," said an old man named John Mahoney, the son of Nora, who had laid rosemary by the brewery gates. "It's been hours since the flood." But the city was unmoved. Progress had little patience for ghosts. When the demolition began, the workers found the past waiting for them. The first swing of a pickaxe released a smell so sharp and strange that one of the men gagged. Beneath the foundations, the soil was black and wet. The foreman dipped his fingers in it and sniffed. "Sweet," he said, frowning. "Like syrup." They uncovered fragments of barrels warped and fossilized by time, and the remnants of old beams stained dark as mahogany. At the deepest point, they struck wood, an ancient plank, carved with a single initial, M. Word spread fast. The laborers whispered that the ground itself was cursed, that beer still slept beneath it, waiting. By the third day, half the crew refused to work after dusk. The foreman hired replacements and pressed on. Within a month, New Street was gone, razed, leveled, and carted away in wagons. In its place rose a row of narrow brick houses, prim and modern, each with neat sash windows and white plaster walls. The city congratulated itself. But the new tenants soon learned what the mapmakers did not. On humid nights, when the fog lay low, a smell would drift through their rooms, sweet, heavy, unmistakable. It seeped from the cracks in the floorboards, from the seams around the windows, from the drains that gurgled long after rain had stopped. Babies would wake crying, and their mothers swore they heard dripping in the walls. One woman moved out, after claiming she'd seen her kitchen tiles darken in the moonlight, as though something were rising beneath them. Within 5 years, the houses stood empty again. The city called it superstition, but even rats avoided the block. The council walled it off, then paved it over, folding the land into a widening of the street that led toward Bloomsbury. The maps no longer marked it. New Street, the place where the flood had hit first, was erased, its memory flattened under horse hooves and wheels. But the locals never stopped speaking of it. They said that when the fog grew thick and the air turned sweet, you could still hear the faint creak of barrels rolling somewhere underfoot. The cobbles would glisten as if wet, though the rain had not yet come, and if you lingered too long, breathing in that impossible scent, you might swear the city itself was exhaling one long, sorrowful sigh for the street it had drowned twice, once in beer and once in forgetfulness. By the time Victoria sat on the throne, the story of the beer flood had already become a curiosity, something old men recited in pubs when the conversation ran dry. A whole street washed away, they'd say, raising their glasses, and all for love of a drink. The younger patrons would laugh, shake their heads, and order another round. Tragedy, like beer, had a way of aging into amusement once the taste of grief faded. At the rebuilt Horseshoe Brewery, production thrived. The new vats were taller, stronger, riveted with steel instead of bound with wood. The workers spoke of safety and science, but every so often one of them would run his hand along the curved iron and feel it hum faintly beneath his palm, as if something inside were restless. None lingered long enough to listen closely. London was a city that taught its people to move forward, not down. In taverns across the city, Meux porter flowed freely again, poured into pint glasses that caught the amber glow of the gas lights. It was dark, rich, comforting the drink of dock workers, watchmen, and weary clerks alike. To most, it was just beer. But to those who remembered, each mouthful carried the faintest trace of something heavier, something the palate couldn't name. One evening, in a snug little pub off Bloomsbury Lane, an elderly lamplighter named Robert Langley leaned over his glass and said to no one in particular, "You can still taste it, you know, the flood." The barkeep laughed, thinking he was drunk, but Langley wasn't smiling. "It's true," he said. "The city never stopped brewing it. You can wash away the bodies, rebuild the vats, but the earth remembers the flavor." The man beside him scoffed. "Nonsense. The flood was 50 years ago." Langley swirled the beer in his glass. The foam left slow, sticky trails on the inside. "Aye," he said softly, "and yet every pint in London still runs through the same pipes, over the same stones, drawn from the same river that carried them all away. You think that don't leave a taste?" The barkeep shook his head, but when he lifted his own mug, he hesitated a little before drinking. Outside, the rain began. It pattered against the windows, steady and soft, the same rhythm the survivors once swore they could hear under the floorboards, the memory of the flood trickling through time. The smell of malt hung in the pub, heavy and sweet, mingling with pipe smoke. Across town, in the grand parlours of Mayfair, gentlemen sipped the same porter from crystal glasses. They toasted to progress, to commerce, to the wealth that industry had brought. None of them thought of Street Giles. None of them tasted the sorrow behind the sweetness. But the workers in the brewery did. The flavor lingered at the back of their throats, a reminder that history was not buried, it was brewed. That night, when the last patron left, Langley finished his pint in silence. He set the glass down carefully and traced the Quaitu, condensation, with one finger. The mark it left was small and perfect, a ring that glowed faintly in the dim light before fading. Outside, the puddles gleamed with the same brown sheen they had on the night of the flood. Somewhere far below the city, in the old cellars no one entered anymore, water dripped steadily, each drop falling into what might have been a void or a vat that had never quite stopped filling. In the morning, the pub opened again, and fresh kegs were rolled in from the Meux yard. The first pint of the day was poured, frothy and dark. The barkeep sniffed it, smiled, and handed it to the waiting customer. "Smooth," the man said after a long sip. "Has a taste I can't quite place." The barkeep only nodded. Some flavors, after all, are older than their makers. The brewery's new cellars were deeper than before, vaulted tunnels of brick and iron built on the bones of the old ones. They stretched beneath Tottenham Court Road like a second city, cool and echoing, where the air always smelled faintly of yeast and damp stone. Most of the workers avoided the lowest level. It wasn't the darkness that frightened them, nor the chill, but the silence. It pressed close, as if listening. By day, the lower cellars were practical enough. Barrels rolled along rails, steam hissed through pipes, the air vibrated with the clatter of labor. But at night, when the furnaces cooled and the city above went quiet, strange sounds began, dripping where no water ran, the faint clink of glass when no bottle stood, a low hum, rhythmic and slow, pulsing from the walls like breath drawn through hidden lungs. At first, the men laughed it off. Every brewery has its noises, they said. Buildings this big have to exhale somehow. But one by one, they started refusing to stay late. The night porter, a thin man named James Beattie, worked those hours alone. He was paid extra for it. Easiest job in London, he boasted at the public house. Only ghosts to mind. Yet each morning he climbed the steps back into daylight with a face a shade paler than before. One evening the foreman asked him, half in jest, what he saw down there. Beattie hesitated. "Nothing," he said. Then, quieter. "Not see. Here." The next night he came early, lantern in hand, determined to prove himself foolish. He walked the cellar's length, his light swaying over the barrels. Everything looked as it should. Rows of wood bound tight with iron, the floor slick with old moisture. The hum was there, faint and deep, vibrating in the soles of his boots. He followed it to the farthest vault, where a single stone arch led into the oldest part of the brewery, the section built directly over the ruins of the vat that had burst. The air grew warmer there, and sweeter. The smell of malt thickened until it clung to his tongue. His lantern flickered. Beattie stopped and raised it. The bricks ahead glistened as though wet. A single drop of brown liquid gathered on the ceiling and fell with a soft pat into the dust. He crouched and touched it. It smelled like beer, fresh, strong, impossibly alive. Behind him, something shifted. A scrape, like a barrel being dragged. He turned, heart hammering, and saw nothing but shadows. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The drip came again, louder now, steady, like the ticking of a clock. He backed away, eyes fixed on the archway. For an instant, he thought he saw movement in the gloom, a ripple, as if the air itself had turned liquid. Beattie ran. His lantern struck the wall, went dark, and shattered. When the foreman found him hours later, he was sitting on the steps at street level, hands clenched, face drenched in sweat. He never spoke of what he saw, only handed in his notice the next morning. "The cellars breathe," he muttered. "They remember." No one volunteered to replace him. After that, the brewery kept the lowest vault locked. Officially, it was unsafe, unstable masonry, they said. But every few months, one of the workers claimed to hear sounds rising through the floorboards above it. A faint, dripping, or a whisper that might have been laughter. And when the wind was just right, blowing from the north, the smell of beer would drift up through the cracks, warm and sweet, as though the flood had never ended, only retreated underground to wait. By the end of that year, locals began calling the place the Ghost Cellar. Some said that when the city slept, you could still hear the corks popping, faint as bubbles breaking the surface of a dream. Others swore that once, just once, they'd seen a soft brown shimmer moving beneath the brewery floor, as though London itself had learned to ferment its memories. No one went down there again, but the locks rusted, slowly, and sometimes, in the stillest hour before dawn, the foreman swore he could smell porter rising from the cracks, and a quiet sigh that might have been relief or thirst. After the last collapse of the century, when the brewery's name had been sold, repainted, and passed like inheritance from one indifferent heir to another, the Meux yard began to quiet. The roar of barrels, the whistle of steam, the clatter of hooves, these softened, year by year, until only the low hum of machinery remained. The Horseshoe Brewery, once a beating heart of London's industry, had turned into something else entirely, a monument to what the city had learned to ignore. The foremen still kept their ledgers, but fewer pages filled each month. Porter was no longer the drink of the age. Pale ales, bitters, and lighter spirits took its place. The great vats, built to hold oceans, now stood half full, echoing with every drop that struck their bottoms. When visitors came for tours, guides told them stories about the Great Flood of 1814. They said it with a smile, as though describing a carnival. 8 souls lost, they'd say. Can you imagine? Beer running through the streets. The tourists laughed, shook their heads, and carried on to the tasting room. But among the workers, those few who still remembered the city's older shadows, the laughter felt wrong. They had inherited the silence that the brewery itself seemed to breathe. It gathered in corners, behind pipes, beneath the new vats that never quite lost their smell of damp wood. At night, when the furnaces cooled and the city noise dulled to a far hum, that silence changed its shape. It wasn't peace, it was waiting. One night, long after the last delivery cart had rattled away, a clerk named Daniel Wren stayed behind to finish accounts. He worked in the counting house above the main yard, where the floorboards creaked with every step. It was an ordinary task, copying figures, closing the ledger, but as the gaslight flickered, he heard something beneath him. A long, hollow note, low as the sound of wind trapped in a tunnel. He paused, the pen in his hand, trembled. Then it came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. A moan, deep within the structure. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked down. The yard was empty. The rain that had begun at dusk was now a thin mist, curling over the cobblestones. The vats loomed like great sleeping beasts in the half-light. Nothing moved. Daniel forced a laugh at himself. "Old pipes," he said aloud, as though the air needed convincing. Yet as he sat back down, the smell reached him, faint, sweet, impossible. Beer. Fresh, warm beer, though none had been brewed in that room for decades. It lingered for only a moment before fading again, like a ghost brushing past. He left the building that night without locking up, walking quickly, his footsteps echoing through the narrow lane. Behind him, the rain thickened. For a moment, he thought he heard another set of footsteps, slow, heavy, but when he turned, there was only the wet gleam of the yard and the soft hiss of rain on metal. In the weeks that followed, the remaining workers noticed other small things. Papers damp in the morning, though the roof didn't leak. A faint rattling from the iron hoops when the temperature dropped, a ripple across the surface of a vat, though the liquid inside was still. They spoke of it quietly, afraid to be mocked. "The brewery's gone hollow," one said. "It's remembering itself." Eventually, the owners closed the yard for good. The vats were drained, the gates locked. But even empty, the building refused to fall silent. On certain nights, neighbors swore they heard it, the distant clang of iron, the trickle of unseen water, the slow, deliberate sigh of something vast beneath the floor. When the demolition finally came years later, the first strike of the hammer sent up a smell so strong that the men stopped mid-swing. "Christ," one muttered, "it smells like beer." The others laughed uneasily. The foreman told them to keep going, but as the walls came down, every blow echoed louder than it should have, as though striking not brick, but memory itself. By dusk, only the shell of the brewery remained a dark outline against the London fog. The city carried on as it always had. indifferent, restless, alive. But in the hollow space where the vats had once stood, a faint sound persisted, almost tender in its rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. It was the silence learning to speak again, one drop at a time. When the Horseshoe Brewery finally fell silent for good, London's memory of it began to fade into folklore. But just before the last walls were pulled down, a young photographer named Edwin Talbot was sent by the Illustrated London News to capture the old monument of porter and progress. It was the spring of 1872, a soft and windless morning when the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and dust. The light was perfect, the kind photographers dream of, muted, steady, almost reverent. Edwin had grown up hearing his father's stories about the beer flood. The old man had been a boy in St. Giles when it happened, had seen the wave rolling through the streets like a living thing. He never spoke of it without touching the small scar on his temple, a mark left by flying debris. To Edwin, the flood had always seemed less like history and more like a family inheritance, something carried in the blood. When his editor told him to photograph the brewery before its demolition, he felt it like a summons. He arrived just after sunrise, camera and tripod strapped to his back. The gates hung half open, rust streaking their hinges. Inside, the yard was overgrown with weeds that sprouted between the stones. The once mighty vats lay dismantled, stacked like enormous ribs. The windows were broken, their glass glittering faintly in the morning light. Edwin set up his camera near the central arch, where the great vat had once stood. He had seen drawings of it towering, round, impossible. But the reality was stranger. The earth here was darker than anywhere else, as though it had been burned. When he knelt to steady his tripod, he caught the faint scent of sweetness rising from the soil. It stopped him cold. He adjusted his lens, focusing on the far wall where time had painted a ghostly outline, a curve darker than the rest of the brick, shaped like the shadow of something immense. He took his exposure, counting softly under his breath. When the plate was done, he slid it back into its box, careful as a priest handling relics. But as he prepared his next shot, he noticed something. In the corner of his frame, a thin wisp of fog had formed, not from the air, but from the ground itself. It drifted upward, pale brown at the edges, curling like breath on a cold morning. He stepped forward, squinting. The fog thickened slightly, then dispersed as if disturbed by unseen motion. A trick of light, he told himself. Damp soil, nothing more. But when he developed the plate that evening in his darkroom, the image stole his breath. The vats were there, the yard, the archway, every line crisp. Yet faintly, impossibly, a shape stood in the center of the frame. It was blurred, almost translucent, the outline of a man in a brewer's apron, one hand resting on something unseen. Around his legs, the air seemed to ripple. He examined the negative again and again, convinced it was a flaw in the emulsion. But every time the image emerged, the figure was there, and behind it, barely visible, almost like smoke, was the curved shadow of a vat. Edwin tried to sleep that night, but couldn't. The smell of chemicals and developer mingled with something else, sweet, yeasty, old, the scent of beer. He dreamed of the photograph coming alive, of the shadow figure stepping forward, wet footprints forming on the darkroom floor. In the morning, he packed the plate away and never showed it to his editor. When asked for his report, he said the negatives were spoiled by damp and offered a simple sketch instead. The newspaper printed it under the headline, "End of the Horseshoe Brewery, a relic of London's past." Years later, when Edwin died, his belongings were auctioned off. Among them was a sealed box labeled, "Do not open." Inside, wrapped in black cloth, was the photograph. The image had faded, but the ghostly figure remained, faint and certain, watching from the ruins of a brewery that no longer existed. And if one held the plate up to the light just right, the gloss of the glass shimmered with a strange, amber hue, as though the image itself had been brewed, and the past was still fermenting quietly within it. By the turn of the 20th century, The London beer flood of 1814 had become a footnote in the city's archives, a curiosity tucked between cholera outbreaks and railway openings. Yet every few years, someone would rediscover it. A journalist short on copy, a historian chasing forgotten disasters, a scholar searching for meaning in the mess of progress. They always began the same way. Few now remember. The first of the modern chroniclers was Professor Lionel Grant of King's College, a tidy man with a passion for industrial accidents. In 1908, he presented a lecture titled "The Perils of Progress, London's Forgotten Flood." The audience, expecting diagrams and statistics, instead received something stranger, a meditation on hubris, on the cost of ambition, measured not in shillings, but in silence. "It is not the beer that fascinates us," Grant said, "but the blindness of men who built gods out of barrels." The hall had gone very still. His paper was printed in a small academic journal, read by a handful of engineers and clergymen. Some admired its poetry, others called it sentimental nonsense. "No ghosts in the pipes," scoffed one reviewer. "Just bad carpentry and pressure." Still, Grant's words lingered. They reminded London that beneath its pavements were stories that refused to stay buried. A decade later, during the Great War, another scholar, Miss Beatrice Linton of the London School of Hygiene, found herself drawn to the same event. She was researching sanitation and urban poverty, combing through 19th-century coroners' reports. There, amid the bureaucratic detritus, she found the flood records, 8 names, all from Street, Giles, and a column labeled "Cause of Death." The handwriting, careful and impersonal, read, "By inundation of beer." Beatrice stared at the phrase for a long time. It felt absurd, almost comical, until she imagined the water rising, the sound of it, the smell. She wrote her own paper, "Inundation, the Anatomy of a Forgotten Disaster." Unlike Grant, she focused on the people. She described their homes, their wages, the way the flood had struck the poorest, hardest. "London," she wrote, "is a city forever drowning its poor, though the fluid changes with the age, beer, smoke, disease, neglect." Her colleagues called it political, which in those days was another word for unbecoming. Her name faded from the journals, but her copy of the coroner's record survived, folded carefully into a diary. By the 1950s, the flood was history's novelty again. Schoolboys told it as a joke. Imagine dying drunk without drinking. Tour guides included it between the Great Fire and Jack the Ripper, a grisly anecdote for tourists who wanted shivers with their sightseeing. A new generation of skeptics emerged, historians with sharp pens who called the whole affair exaggerated. 8 dead, hardly a tragedy. One wrote, "London has lost more in a night to fog." But the skeptics never walked the alleys where New Street once stood. They didn't smell the faint sweetness that still rose on humid evenings, nor hear the quiet dripping in the basements that had survived demolition. Those who lived nearby said the scent grew strongest after rain, and that sometimes, when the fog thickened, you could hear the faint clink of barrels from beneath the pavement. In 1974, a graduate student named Colin Havers unearthed an old photograph at an estate sale, the one taken by Edwin Talbot a century earlier. He wrote to the museum, claiming it proved spiritual contamination at the site of the brewery. The curator filed the letter under Curiosities Unverified. But before doing so, he opened the envelope and held the plate up to the light. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a ripple across the image, as though something was shifting inside the glass. Then he blinked, and it was gone. By the century's end, the beer flood had become a ghost of a ghost, too small for tragedy, too strange for myth. Scholars argued dates, skeptics mocked the melodrama, and the living went on drinking. Yet in certain corners of London, where the air turned warm and sweet for no reason, the smell of porter still drifted up from somewhere unseen, an uninvited footnote that refused to close. And whether they admitted it or not, every historian who wrote about the beer flood ended the same way. By describing the smell, they could measure the gallons, trace the deaths, even name the streets, but they could never explain the scent that lingered, as if the past itself were fermenting just beneath the skin of the city. By the 1980s, the brewery was long gone, replaced by offices and a small park that no one lingered in after dark. The air above Tottenham Court Road smelled of petrol and rain now, not malt. Yet London has a way of turning its tragedies into attractions, polishing their rough edges until they gleam with irony. And so it was that, on the corner nearest where the flood began, a new pub opened its doors. The Brewer's Tragedy. It was the kind of place that pretended to be old. The signboard was freshly painted but cracked at the edges for effect. The interior was all dark wood, imitation brass, and candlelight trapped in glass domes. Behind the bar hung a framed newspaper clipping, Great Beer Flood of 1814, an act of God, and beside it, a print of Edwin Talbot's photograph. No one knew it was the original. The pub was popular with tourists, students, and office clerks. They came for the gimmick pints served in old-fashioned tankards, porter poured, theatrically from barrels, staff dressed in aprons and flat caps. The menu offered flood pudding, the Meux pie, and a house ale called 8 Souls Stout. The owners said the name honored history. The locals said it mocked the dead. But for all the laughter and camera flashes, the pub held something uneasy. Regulars claimed the air grew heavy after closing time. The lights would flicker once, precisely at midnight, and a faint dripping sound would echo from the cellars, though no tap was left running. The manager, a pragmatic woman named Susan Kent, dismissed it all. "Old pipes," she said. "It's London. Everything leaks." Yet she could not explain the smell. It came only on warm, still nights, a sweetness under the dust, faint but unmistakable. The first time she noticed it, she was locking up after hours. The staff had gone, the music was off, and she stood alone at the bar counting the till when the air shifted. For a moment she thought someone had spilled a drink, but the floor was dry. The scent thickened, rich and yeasty, and she felt suddenly dizzy, as if the room were tilting. Then the silence broke a single creak from the cellar door. Susan froze. The door was locked, yet it trembled slightly in its frame. She stared, waiting. The trembling stopped. The air cooled. The smell faded. When she unlocked the door the next morning, she found nothing unusual, just kegs stacked neatly, the stone floor slick with condensation. She told no one. Word of the haunting spread anyway. Patrons swore they saw things in the mirrors, faces that weren't their own, reflections that lingered a heartbeat too long. One night, a student claimed a pint glass lifted from the bar by itself and shattered mid-air. Another said he heard laughter rising from beneath the floorboards. The staff rolled their eyes, but secretly, none of them liked being downstairs alone. On the flood's anniversary, the pub filled to bursting. People toasted the lost souls, pretending reverence, but craving spectacle. At midnight, the lights dimmed and someone read aloud the old coroner's verdict. Death by inundation of beer. The crowd laughed and raised their glasses. For a brief, glittering moment, it felt like a festival. Then the laughter died. A silence spread through the room, thick, absolute. The air smelled suddenly stronger, sharp with sweetness, like beer left too long in the sun. The candles flickered. From below came a slow, deliberate drip. 1, 2, 3. Susan turned toward the cellar door. The brass handle glistened as if wet. No one spoke. The jukebox clicked on by itself and played the faint opening of a song, something slow and old, a tavern tune about the river. Then it stopped, abruptly, as though cut short by a breath. When the lights steadied again, the scent was gone. The crowd erupted into nervous applause, deciding it was all a clever performance. But Susan didn't smile. She locked the cellar and went home, early. That night she dreamed of dark water rising between the tables, of mugs floating like lilies, of laughter turning to screams. The next morning, the bar smelled faintly of yeast. On the counter, where no one had worked since the night before, Someone or something had drawn a single wet ring, perfectly round, glistening in the morning light. Tourists still come to the brewer's tragedy. They drink, they laugh, they take pictures of the old clipping on the wall. They never notice that the ink has begun to blur, as if damp had crept into the frame. And every so often, when the pub is quiet and the air hangs heavy, the faint scent of porter rises once more, sweet, soft, and sorrowful. The city still remembers, even when it pretends not to. By the early 21st century, only the foundations of the Meux Brewery remained, buried beneath asphalt and modern scaffolding. A sleek glass building now stood where the vats once towered, its facade reflecting a city unrecognizable from the one that drowned in beer 2 centuries earlier. The world had changed. London no longer smelled of coal and malt, but of coffee, exhaust, and rain. Yet beneath that progress, the old city slept on, its secrets sealed under layers of stone and time. In 2014, on the 200th anniversary of the flood, a team of developers broke ground for a new underground car park. The work began, as all modern work did, with permits, deadlines, and no memory of what had come before. The contractors joked about the past as they dug. "Careful, lads," one laughed. "Don't let the beer out again." By the 3rd week, the excavation reached the depth of the original cellars. The soil changed there, dark, damp, strangely soft. The foreman, a Welshman named Hughes, climbed down to inspect. The earth smelled faintly sweet, though no one else seemed to notice. He crouched, ran his hand through it, and found the soil clinging to his skin in syrupy streaks. "Odd," he murmured, "feels almost oily." That afternoon, a digger's bucket struck something solid, metal. The crew gathered round as the earth was cleared. What they uncovered was the rusted curve of an enormous iron hoop, half buried, black as old blood. Beneath it, the wood of a barrel, no, not a barrel, a vat, its staves fossilized by pressure and time. The men fell silent. Hughes whistled softly. "Looks like they left a piece behind." Word spread quickly. Archaeologists arrived, cameras flashed, and reporters from the BBC came to film the rediscovery of the Meux vat. London smiled at the story, another curiosity for the history pages. "The city that drowned in beer," the headlines read. Viewers laughed over breakfast, shaking their heads. It was quaint, harmless, far away. But the workers who stayed after the cameras left began to notice things. First, the smell faint at dawn, stronger by evening. Sweet, almost comforting at first, then cloying, nauseating. Next came the moisture. The soil refused to dry, no matter how many pumps were brought in. A film of brownish liquid gathered at the bottom of the pit each morning. The engineers tested it. "Just groundwater," they said. But Hughes thought otherwise. On the night before the excavation was due to close, he returned alone. The city above glimmered with electric light, yet down there, in the pit, the air was heavy and warm. He switched on his torch and descended. The beam cut through mist that hadn't been there that afternoon. It hung low, golden brown, swirling gently as if stirred by breath. He knelt beside the iron hoop. The wood beneath it looked wet again, glistening faintly. He touched it. It was warm. The smell struck him at once, thick, rich, alive. Not decay, not water, beer. Something shifted deep beneath the soil, a soft creak like the turning of wood under strain. Hughes stumbled back, dropping his light. The sound grew louder, a slow groan, then a low bubbling, like air rising through syrup. He froze. The earth at his boots darkened, gleaming. A drop formed on the old wood and fell with a quiet plink. Then another, and another. By the time the crew arrived in the morning, the pit was dry again. The pumps hummed. The air smelled clean. Hughes said nothing, though the soles of his boots were sticky with something faintly amber. He left the site that afternoon, never returned, and would not speak of what he'd seen. Within a year, the new building opened, sleek, glass-fronted, its lower level gleaming with concrete floors and fluorescent light. The owners toasted with champagne at the opening ceremony, But the janitors who worked the night shift soon whispered of a scent that rose from the vents on humid evenings, warm, sweet, unmistakable. Beer. Most dismissed it as imagination, the residue of history, the ghost of yeast in the stones. Yet sometimes, in the lowest car bays, they found faint puddles, sticky to the touch. No pipes leaked, no waterline broke. Just the last drop, seeping slowly through the centuries, patient, undying, and still thirsty. Time dulled the memory, as it always does, but it never erased the flavor. 200 years after the night London drowned in beer, the story persisted, distilled into trivia, pub quizzes, and ghost tours. Guides in bowler hats led visitors through street, Giles, pausing near glass towers and fast food chains to gesture at the ground and declare, "Here, once, the beer ran waist deep." The tourists laughed, took photographs, and moved on, never sensing that the air itself still held a trace of sweetness, faint but unmistakable, like breath caught in glass. But some noticed. Bartenders and brewers, mostly the kind of people who paid attention to taste. They said that every pint of porter drawn in London carried something impossible to describe, a whisper of warmth, a softness that lingered on the tongue longer than it should. It wasn't a flavor anyone could name. It was a feeling, like nostalgia disguised as bitterness. History, some called it. Others said it was just the water, the same river that had swallowed so much. In the year 2020, a craft brewery opened a few streets from where the Horseshoe once stood. The owners, clever with marketing, named their first batch 1814 Revival Stout. They brewed it dark and strong, using a Victorian recipe pulled from archives. The launch was a success. Reviewers wrote that it was uncannily authentic, rich with memory, a drink that tastes like the past. The brewers laughed at their own luck until one of them noticed the smell. It wasn't unpleasant at first, just a sweetness that filled the brewing room, heavier than malt, older somehow. The vats hissed quietly in the dim light, condensation running down their sides like sweat. One night, the head brewer stayed late to bottle the last of the batch. The building was silent except for the steady tick of cooling metal. Then, from somewhere near the floor drain, came a faint drip. He frowned, checking for leaks. The sound grew louder, drip, 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 until it became a rhythm, soft but steady, echoing off the tiled walls. He crouched, peering into the grate. The air that rose from it was warm, and when he inhaled, the sweetness was so thick it made him dizzy. He stood quickly, but the room was already changing. The scent deepened, turning syrupy, intoxicating. The stainless steel vats shone darker in the amber light, their reflections rippling. For one heartbeat, he thought he heard a sigh, long and patient, like something exhaling from beneath the floor. Then it stopped. The next morning, he told no one, though the smell still clung to his clothes. The bottled beer sold out in days. Drinkers praised its uncanny richness. "It tastes alive," one wrote in a review, "like it remembers you." Months passed, and 1814 Revival became a permanent fixture in pubs across the city. People toasted it at weddings, football matches, funerals. They drank it without thought. Though some claimed, the hangover it left was strange. Not pain exactly, but a heaviness in the chest, as though something ancient was sitting there, listening. And on certain nights, when the pubs grew loud and the tables wet with spilled porter, a quiet moment would come just before closing. The laughter would fade for a heartbeat, the air would thicken with sweetness, and every glass in the room would seem to tremble slightly, as if remembering the river of beer that once ran through London's streets. The bartenders were the first to notice it, the pause, the hum, the faint ripple across the surface of untouched pints. Most shrugged it off, but others, the older ones, nodded knowingly. "It's just the flood saying good night," they'd whisper, because some flavors, once brewed into the world, never really fade. They live in the water, in the air, in the soil. They rise when the city is warm and quiet, when laughter echoes through its stone lungs. And if you're patient, if you close your patient eyes and take one slow sip. You might taste it too, the sweetness of grief, the warmth of memory, the ghost of joy that still foams on London's lips. The taste that lingers is not beer, nor time, nor sorrow. It is everything that refuses to be forgotten. It is said that cities never truly rest, that even in the still hours before dawn, when the air holds its breath and the streets lie bare, something unseen keeps watch. In London, that something has the smell of malt and rain. The centuries have turned its tragedies into folklore and its wounds into foundations, but below the glass and the noise, the old heart still beats, slow and sticky, like a drop that refuses to dry. When the last tube rattles home and the lights of Tottenham Court Road fade, the city exhales. Steam seeps from vents, puddles glimmer beneath street lamps, and for a fleeting hour, London remembers what it once was, a city of cellars, of pipes, of fluids, flowing unseen. Down in the basements of Bloomsbury, janitors on the night shift sometimes pause, heads tilted, certain they've heard dripping where no water runs. It's never loud, just the quiet, patient rhythm of time fermenting beneath the earth. In one such basement, beneath a cafe that stands where the Prospolder, Meux Brewery once began, an old maintenance worker named Alfred tends the boilers. He doesn't believe in ghosts, he believes in pressure valves, in faulty gaskets, in the ache of his knees on cold tiles. But on certain nights, when the air grows warm and the walls seem to hum, he feels it the same sweetness his grandfather once described. Beer, from before, the old man used to say, from the flood that never ended. Alfred had laughed then, as all children do. But now, alone at midnight, the memory makes him set down his wrench and listen. The sound always begins faintly, as if behind another wall. A sigh, then a pulse, then a slow drip. The pipes tremble, the smell deepens. It is not rot, not decay. It is something richer, older. He follows it sometimes, down the narrow corridor behind the boiler, past the door that was bricked up long before his time. When he presses his palm to the cold surface, he swears he can feel moisture seeping through the faintest tackiness, like the skin of a fruit just beginning to ferment. Above him, the city sleeps in glass towers and neon dreams. The pubs have emptied, the streets are washed clean. Yet somewhere beneath the pavement, in the layers where London keeps its memory, the beer still moves. Not a flood now, not rage, but a slow circulation history flowing through cracks and conduits, mingling with the groundwater, whispering to the pipes. At 3 in the morning, the air outside the cafe turns strangely fragrant. A cyclist passing by looks up, slows, and breathes in. For a moment he can taste it: warmth, sweetness, a hint of something impossible. He smiles without knowing why. Then the wind changes, and it's gone. Alfred finishes his rounds. He wipes his hands, locks the door, and climbs the narrow stairs back to the street. The sky above him is the color of pewter, and the first hint of dawn glows at the edge of the horizon. He pauses, glancing once at the ground beneath his boots. The pavement is damp, though it hasn't rained. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. The city murmurs all around him, the faint hiss of steam, the drip of condensation from awnings, the whisper of something ancient still alive underfoot. When London sleeps, it dreams of what it has swallowed. Fires, floods, blood, and beer, it digests them all, turning disaster into legend, legend into air. And as the first light breaks through the fog, the scent fades once more, drawn down into the depths where it belongs. Some nights, when the fog hangs low and the street lamps flicker gold, it rises again, a breath of sweetness in the dark, like a ghost lifting its glass to the living, a silent toast from the drowned to the forgetful. And so the story ends not with the flood, but with the city itself, forever fermenting, forever thirsty, forever remembering.